She was 23 and broke. No apartment, no car, no family address, just a cracked leather purse and $37.18 she had counted under library lamps with cold fingers. And with that money, she bought an abandoned post office for $1 in the weathered township of Hawley Bend, Winneshiek County, Iowa, a place that had fallen off most maps by 1987. The roof sagged over the sorting room. Rain had swollen the back door shut. The county had condemned it since 2009 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the old postmaster's service counter, inside a sealed steel compartment that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hannah Elise Reed had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She had first learned the shape of departure in a narrow rental house outside Cedar Rapids, where the kitchen windows iced over from the inside each January, and the heat came up through the floor in dry metallic sighs. Her mother, Marlene, worked the early shift at a grocery store bakery, leaving before dawn with flour still under one thumbnail and a thermos of coffee wrapped in a dish towel. Her father had gone before Hannah was old enough to remember his walking gait, though she kept a photograph of him folded inside a children's Bible because she liked the way his hand rested on the hood of a blue pickup, as if the truck were a horse he trusted. There were not many keepsakes in that house. Rent moved them every year or two. A landlord sold one place, a pipe burst in another. One winter, the basement of a duplex filled with brown water while Hannah was at school, and by the time she came home, 3 cardboard boxes of school papers and Christmas ornaments had softened into pulp. She learned early that a thing could disappear without anyone meaning harm. That was one kind of loss. Another kind sat down at the table and stayed. Marlene was not a cruel woman. She was tired in the way good cloth becomes thin after too many washings. She kept coupons in envelopes, wrote grocery totals on the backs of receipts, and measured out laundry detergent with the seriousness of medicine. When Hannah was 7, her mother married a man named Rick Danner, who installed cable TV for a company out of Marion, and kept his work boots beside the furnace with their toes lined exactly to the wall. Rick did not shout often, he did not need to. He had a gift for making a room adjust around him. A spoon set down too hard, a cabinet left open, a sock dropped near the hamper. All of it could change the air before supper. He liked a house stripped down and obedient. Nothing on countertops. Nothing sentimental in sight. He believed that old things were usually dirty, broken, or proof that somebody had failed to move on. Hannah believed the opposite, though she did not yet have words for it. The person who gave her words was her mother's uncle, Amos Whitaker, who lived in a clapboard house north of Decorah, where pasture fences leaned into sumac and the mornings smelled of wood smoke, wet hay, and iron-rich soil. Amos was not her grandfather, not by the strict paper lines of family, but he became the elder whose house held a place for her. He had been a cabinet maker, a letter carrier, and in his later years the careful repairer of things no one else wanted to mend, chairs with split stretchers, mantel clocks with missing glass, writing desks scarred by cigarettes and water rings. He never spoke of them as objects. He spoke of them as work still waiting. Every other Saturday, when Marlene could spare the gas, Hannah was dropped at his place before breakfast. Amos would already have the stove blacked, the percolator ticking on the back burner, and a pan of Johnny cake cooling under a linen towel. He wore suspenders over wool shirts and kept a pencil behind one ear, sharpened with a pocket knife rather than a sharpener. His hands were square, the nails thick, the knuckles swollen from decades of planes, saws, mailbags, weather, and stubborn hinges. Their ritual never changed much, and that was its mercy. First, they ate at the kitchen table without turning on the radio. Then Amos let Hannah choose one damaged thing from the mudroom shelf, a footstool, a picture frame, a child's rocker with one arm cracked clean through. He would set it on the bench beneath the east window where the morning light came in pale and exact, and he would ask her to look before touching. "Tell me where it gave way," he would say. At first she guessed. A scratch here, a loose nail there. Amos would shake his head and wait. Waiting was one of the first crafts he taught her. Not woodworking. Not gluing or clamping or sanding. Waiting. The eye needed time to stop being proud. By the time she was 12, she could find the hairline fracture under old varnish, the warped rail, the dowel that had shrunk in its hole. Amos taught her how hide glue smelled when warmed, how walnut darkened under oil, how cedar kept a sweetness even after 100 winters. He taught her that a properly sharpened chisel did not need force, and that force was often a confession that someone had failed to prepare. On rainy afternoons, when the shop roof drummed softly and the gutters overflowed into barrels, he took out letters from a metal box. Some were his, some had belonged to others. He had delivered mail across farms and hollows for 31 years, back when county roads were gravel and mailbox flags froze in place. He remembered names by roots: Widow Jensen with the Bluebird houses, the Pavelka twins who both wrote home from Vietnam in the same narrow hand, a teacher in Burr Oak who received seed catalogues every February, though she had no garden anyone could see. "A letter is not paper," Amos told Hannah once, holding up an envelope browned by age. "It is someone trying to arrive." She never forgot that. Not because it sounded grand, but because he said it while repairing the envelope flap with wheat paste and a brush, so fine it looked made for eyelashes. To Amos, arrival mattered. Repair mattered. The effort to carry something across distance mattered, even if no one applauded it. When Hannah was 16, Amos began to forget small things. At first it was only a misplaced rasp, a burner left unlit beneath a pan, a name that came slowly and then arrived in pieces. He laughed at himself, but he laughed less each month. Marlene said he was getting old. Rick said the county would take the place eventually. Hannah said nothing. She started visiting every Saturday, then Sundays too when she could borrow a car. She labelled drawers in the shop with blue painter's tape. She wrote down recipes for glue and wax. She learned which neighbours checked on him and which did not. The last winter he was alive, Amos gave her a dovetail saw with a walnut handle worn black by his palm. "You do not own what you cannot care for," he said. It was the only sentence of his that ever felt like a commandment. He meant the saw, of course. He meant the tools, the house, the letters, the workbench scarred by 3 generations of hands. But he also meant memory. He meant skill. He meant the patient duty of not letting the world become disposable merely because grief had made it inconvenient to keep. He died on a February morning when ice glazed the fence wire and the pasture looked like it had been breathed over by glass. Hannah was in her senior year of high school. By the time she reached his house, the ambulance had already gone, and Marlene was standing in the kitchen with her coat still buttoned, staring at the stove as if it had accused her. The legal papers were not kind. Amos had left no clear will that anyone could find. The house went into a dispute between distant relatives, tax offices, and a lender whose name Hannah had never heard spoken at the kitchen table. Boxes vanished into trucks. The bench disappeared. So did the planes, the clamps, the letterbox, the jars of brass screws, the oil stones wrapped in rags, and the old postal satchel Amos had kept on a peg near the back door. Hannah asked about them for months. Nobody knew, nobody had seen, nobody remembered. Only the dovetail saw remained, because she had carried it home beneath her winter coat. Rick hated that saw. He did not say so directly at first. He only moved it from Hannah's desk to the closet, from the closet to a storage tote, from the storage tote to the garage where damp air raised a faint bloom on the blade. Hannah cleaned it with oil and fine steel wool, then wrapped it in one of her old flannel shirts. After graduation, she worked at a print shop, then a thrift store, then a county records office where she spent afternoons scanning property deeds older than any living clerk. She liked the records. The language was exact. Meaties and bounds, easements, quitclaim, parcel number, names moving across paper with a gravity the living often fail to honour. She saved money slowly. Then she lost it quickly. A medical bill from an urgent care visit, a roommate who left without paying the last month's rent, a used car whose transmission failed at a stoplight on First Avenue while a school bus idled behind her. By 23, Hannah had moved back into Marlene's house temporarily, though everyone knew temporary was a word that depended on the kindness of whoever owned the door. Rick's kindness had always been narrow. He had become heavier in the face, redder around the eyes, more exacting about the thermostat and the refrigerator shelves. He spoke to Hannah as one speaks to a wet coat hung too near good furniture, not with rage, with inconvenience. Marlene moved through the rooms quietly, folding towels, wiping clean counters already clean, asking Hannah whether she had called about work, whether she had checked the listings in Waterloo, whether she had prayed about patience. The eviction did not happen through court papers. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late September, under the kitchen's fluorescent light. While rain ticked against the vent hood outside, Hannah had set Amos's saw on the table because she had been cleaning the handle with beeswax. Rick came in from the garage, saw the tool lying on a folded towel, and stopped as if someone had placed a dead animal beside his supper plate. He picked it up by 2 fingers. "You cannot keep dragging dead men in here." 8 words. No shouting. Just the sentence, "laid down clean." Marlene stood at the sink with both hands in dishwater. Her shoulders rose once, then settled. She did not turn around. A plate slipped beneath the surface and knocked against another with a dull porcelain sound. That was the betrayal Hannah remembered most clearly afterward, not the order to leave. Not the black trash bags Rick brought from under the sink. Not the way he opened the back door before she had finished packing. It was her mother's silence, warm water running over hands that had once braided Hannah's hair before school. Hannah packed in 40 minutes. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, her birth certificate, the folded photograph of her father, a library card, a toothbrush, a spiral notebook, the saw, wrapped again in flannel. She tried to take Amos's old pencil sharpener, the small cast iron one he had once mounted for her on a scrap of pine, but Rick said it belonged to the house because everything in the house belonged to him or to her mother. Hannah looked at Marlene then. Marlene looked down into the sink. The rain had stopped by the time Hannah stepped outside. The pavement shone under the street lamp, and the maple leaves along the curb were pasted flat and dark as old tea. Rick closed the door without slamming it. That was his way. He liked the world to think well of his hinges. For 6 weeks, Hannah moved through Iowa as if she had become part of the weather. She spent the first 2 nights in the Cedar Rapids bus station, sleeping upright beneath a vending machine that hummed without rest. Her purse strap stayed wrapped twice around her wrist. A woman in a red coat gave her half a sleeve of crackers the second morning and did not ask for her story, which Hannah appreciated more than the food. From there she rode to Waterloo because a shelter had beds, but the beds were full by dusk, and she slept behind a church gym where the brick wall held a little heat after sunset. Her money went by exact amounts: $11 to Waterloo, $2.40 for coffee and toast at a diner that let her sit until the lunch crowd came. $6 for a laundromat wash she shared with a college girl who pretended not to notice Hannah brushing her teeth in the bathroom sink. $1 for ibuprofen from a gas station near Independence. 75 cents for a local paper that had already been read soft at the corners. She learned which public libraries opened earliest and which ones had restrooms far from the front desk. She learned that a person could sit for hours with a newspaper in front of her and become almost invisible if she turned a page now and then. In Dubuque, she slept one night in a stairwell behind an insurance office, the concrete smelling of salt, dust, and cigarette smoke. In Manchester, a Methodist volunteer gave her a cot in a fellowship hall and a towel still warm from the dryer. In Waverley, she spent 3 nights in an unlocked hay barn north of town, burrowing between bales while wind pressed against the boards and mice made small business-like sounds in the straw. By the 5th week the nights had hardened, frost silvered the ditches, her socks no longer dried fully in the daytime. She kept Amos's saw inside her coat, not because she feared theft exactly, but because it was the one object that still gave weight to her name. Once in a gas station bathroom near Decorah, she unwrapped it and found a dark fingerprint of rust beginning near the teeth. She rubbed it clean with a paper towel and cooking oil bought in a travel packet meant for salads. The packet cost 39 cents. She wrote that down. Hannah had always written numbers carefully. Money, dates, addresses, bus times, library hours, temperatures posted outside bank signs. Numbers did not comfort her, but they did not pretend either. On October 28th, she had $42.06 because she had found 2 days of work helping a woman in Oelvine clear out a storage unit after a divorce. By November 3rd, she had $37.18. She counted it twice at a table in the Decorah Public Library, beneath a mural of the Upper Iowa River in summer, while outside the real river moved under a sky the color of tin. The classified ad was in the back of a county bulletin, printed crookedly between a notice for used snow tires and a church supper. County disposition sale. Former Hawley Bend Post Office. Condemned structure. Parcel HB 17-044. Minimum bid. 1 bought 000. Buyer assumes all liability. Taxes, repairs, removal, and code compliance. Sealed bids due November 7th, 2019. Inquire at Winneshiek County Clerk's Office. Hannah read it once. Then she read it again with her finger beneath each line. A former post office. The words did something quiet inside her, something she mistrusted because hope, when one is tired, can be as dangerous as hunger. She went to the reference desk and asked for township maps. The librarian, a woman with silver hair pinned low at her neck, brought out a binder of county plats and photocopied 2 pages without charging her. Hawley Bend appeared only as a name near a creek, 7 miles from a road that still carried traffic, and 3 miles from one that did not. No store, no school, no active postmark, a place reduced to outline and memory. The building had been closed for years. The county wanted it gone. Nobody else, Hannah reasoned, would want a condemned structure in a near-empty township with winter coming on. Nobody with choices. At least. She had $1. She also had a saw, a notebook, 2 hands, and Amos's sentence about care lodged in her like a nail set below the surface. That evening she sat on the library steps until the lights inside went out 1 row at a time. Cars passed along the square. Somewhere a restaurant vent released the smell of onions and hot grease. Hannah took from her purse 1 worn dollar bill, folded it lengthwise, and placed it inside the county bulletin to keep the page marked. The bill was soft from use, its corners rounded, its green faded nearly grey. In the morning, she would walk to the clerk's office and make an offer no sensible person would call a plan. But a condemned post office was still a place built for arrival, and Hannah had been leaving long enough. The clerk's office opened at 8:30, and Hannah was already across the street by 10 after, standing beneath a sycamore that had dropped most of its leaves into the courthouse lawn. She had walked there from the library with the county bulletin folded inside her coat, and the dollar bill tucked into the page as if it were a pressed flower. The morning had come down cold, 29 degrees by the bank sign, with a wind that moved through the square and found every thin place in her jacket. Her shoes were not meant for weather. They had been bought for standing behind a thrift store register, not for walking on frost-stiff sidewalks while the sky lightened over brick storefronts and courthouse stone. She went around the block twice before crossing. It was not courage that delayed her. It was arithmetic. Once she handed over the dollar, she would have $36.18 and no promise that the county would take her bid. And no promise that a condemned building could shelter anything more than mice and rot. She knew enough from scanned deeds and property files to understand that ownership was not the same as rescue. Taxes could follow, liens could surface. Code violations could arrive in envelopes that did not care whether the recipient had eaten. Still, the bulletin remained warm from her hand. Inside, the courthouse smelled of floor wax, paper, and the faint mineral odor of steam heat. The hallway was wide and high-ceilinged, with old photographs of county supervisors hung in rows along one wall, each man looking past the camera with the fixed patience of someone who had survived long meetings. A custodian pushed a mop bucket near the stairwell and nodded once at Hannah without curiosity. The county clerk's office sat behind a frosted glass door, lettered in black. Records, taxes, elections, transfers. Beneath the lettering, someone had taped a printed notice about winter parking restrictions. The tape had yellowed at the corners. Hannah opened the door. A bell above it gave a small, tired ring. There were 3 desks inside, though. Only one was occupied. Metal filing cabinets stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. A counter divided the public side from the work side, its varnished oak polished pale, where generations of elbows had waited. Behind it sat a woman in a navy cardigan, with a silver chain on her glasses and haircut square just below her jaw. Her nameplate read, Mr. Zelaine Koslowski, County Clerk. She was not young, but nothing about her seemed softened by age. Her hands moved over paper with dry precision. Her lipstick was the colour of cranberry skin. On the desk beside her sat a brass date stamp, an ink pad, a ceramic mug with a crack at the rim, and a little dish of paper clips sorted by size. Hannah approached the counter and set down the bulletin. Mrs. Koslowski looked at the paper first, then at Hannah's coat, then at Hannah's face. The look was not unkind. It was a clerk's look, practiced from decades of measuring whether a person understood the weight of what they had requested. I am here about the Hawley Bend parcel, Hannah said. The clerk removed her glasses and let them hang from the chain. You understand that structure is condemned? Yes. Ma'am. You understand the county will not repair it? Yes. Ma'am. You understand there is no active water service? Yes. Ma'am. No current electrical account? Yes. Ma'am. No municipal sewer? No inspection warranty? No assurance of habitability? And no promise that the roof will last through January? Hannah swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Koslowski looked down at the bulletin again. And you understand that if the county accepts your bid, you accept liability from the date of transfer? Yes, ma'am. The office seemed to grow still around that answer. Somewhere behind the cabinets, a radiator clicked. A phone rang once in another room and stopped before anyone picked it up. Mrs. Koslowski leaned back slightly. Most people ask to see the property first. I do not have a car. The clerk waited. But Hannah did not explain further. Poverty sometimes became less bearable when translated into sentences. After a moment, Mrs. Koslowski opened a drawer and removed a manila folder with Howley Bend Post Office, written across the tab in blue ink. She laid out the documents one by one. Photographs, a property transfer form, a liability acknowledgement, a tax statement showing a number so low it seemed almost fictional, though even fictional numbers could become impossible if repeated year after year. The county received no other sealed bids, she said. The board authorized administrative acceptance if any bid met minimum disposal amount. She tapped one line with the end of her pen. $1. Hannah took the folded bill from the bulletin. It lay on the counter between them, soft and worn and nearly weightless. Mrs. Koslowski did not touch it at once. You are certain? Yes, ma'am. The clerk put her glasses back on, drew the bill toward her, and opened a receipt book with carbon paper between the pages. Her handwriting was narrow, exact, and slanted forward. She wrote the amount carefully, then turned the book for Hannah to sign. The pen was chained to the counter with a metal bead cord. Hannah held it in her cold fingers and wrote her full name on the line. The letters looked steadier than she felt. Mrs. Koslowski took the deed form next. The brass stamp came down with a firm, official weight, pressing the date into red ink and paper fibre. November 4th, 2019. Another stamp, another signature. Another page turned and clipped and filed. The machinery of the county accepted Hannah calmly, without pity, without celebration, that almost undid her. At last, the clerk placed a copy of the deed, a parcel map, and a thin brass key into a brown envelope. The road is rough past the old Granger place, she said. You go east on County W14 for 5 miles. then south on Hawley Bend Road. It is marked but barely. After the second bridge, you will see walnut trees on the left. The post office sits back from the road, behind a ditch. Do not step on the porch until you test the boards. Yes, ma'am. And do not use the chimney. Yes, ma'am. Or the stairs. Hannah looked up. There are stairs? Cellar steps, Mrs. Kozlowski slid the envelope forward. Granite. Wet. Uneven. If you break an ankle out there, nobody will hear you unless you have made arrangements for somebody to check. Hannah placed both hands on the envelope. I understand. The clerk looked at those hands, chapped across the knuckles, the nails cut short and uneven. Then her eyes moved to the saw handle barely visible beneath Hannah's coat where the flannel had shifted. What was your mother's people's name? Hannah grew careful. Whittaker. Mrs. Kolosklawski's expression changed in a way so slight that the many would have missed it. Not surprise exactly. Recognition arriving after a long walk. Amos Whittaker, she said. Hannah did not answer immediately. My uncle, she said at last. My mother's uncle. The clerk sat back. The office light touched the silver chain at her glasses. He delivered my acceptance letter from Luther College, Mrs. Kozlowski said. 1974. I was the first girl in my family to go. He brought it up our lane himself because the mailbox had been knocked down by a plough. My mother cried into her apron. Hannah stared at her. Mrs. Kozlowski turned one of the paper clips in the dish until it lay parallel with the others. He was a careful man. Yes, Hannah said. The word came out smaller than intended. The clerk reached into the drawer again and removed a second key, darker than the first, with a paper tag tied to it by cotton string. She hesitated, then set it beside the envelope. That may fit the rear door, she said. It was not on the official inventory. Came in with a box of township odds and ends years ago. No reason for the county to keep it. Hannah looked at the key, then at the clerk. Thank you, Mrs. Kozlowski waved the words away with 2 fingers, as if gratitude were paperwork submitted in duplicate. Walk before noon if you're walking. Wind comes harder after 3. The businesses around the square were waking by the time Hannah stepped outside with the envelope held beneath her coat. She passed Knutson Pharmacy, where Christmas garland had already been taped around the front window. Next came Abel's Hardware, its glass crowded with snow shovels, mouse traps, stovepipe sections, and a hand-lettered sign offering storm window plastic by the foot. Across the street, the Sugar Bowl Cafe put out a chalkboard advertising chicken and noodles. Farther down stood Lark and Ledger books, half the front display taken up by used mysteries and local history. At the corner, Havelka Feed and Seed opened its side door, and the smell of cracked corn drifted briefly into the cold. 5 businesses, 5 lit windows. A town still keeping its own pulse. Hannah stopped at the bakery window only long enough to look at the day-old rolls marked half price. She did not go in. The envelope under her arm felt too important to carry into warmth. Warmth made a person consider needs in the wrong order. She bought nothing. The first miles east of town followed a shoulder of gravel where farm fields rolled away under cut corn stubble, and a hawk hung nearly motionless above a ditch. The sky had cleared into a hard blue. Wind moved in long, low sheets across the open ground, flattening dry grass and lifting dust from the roadbed. Every passing truck made her step down into the ditch and brace herself until the grit settled. By noon, the town was behind her. By 1. The courthouse seemed like something from another season. The walk to Hawley Bend was longer than it had looked on the map, because maps did not show how a road rose, dipped, bent, and rose again. They did not show how hunger shortened a person's stride. They did not show how a coat could grow heavy with sweat along the back, while the hands remained numb. Hannah had 1 apple, 2 crackers, and a bottle of water filled at the library bathroom sink. She ate the apple down to the seeds while sitting on a culvert near a pasture where black cattle watched her without moving. A mail truck passed once, white and square and brisk, its red flag painted along the side. The driver lifted 2 fingers from the wheel. Hannah lifted 2 back. The gesture felt like a blessing too modest to name. The old Granger place came after a stand of cottonwoods. Its barn had collapsed inward, the roof forming a shallow V like folded hands. A rusted corn crib leaned beside it, and the farmhouse windows had been covered with plywood silvered by weather. Beyond that, Hawley Bend Road narrowed, gravel thinned into pale dirt. Grass grew between the tire tracks. The county road sign stood at an angle, peppered with birdshot and lichen. 3 miles. Mrs. Koslowski had said. Hannah walked them slowly. She crossed the first bridge over a drainage run, mostly filled with cattails. The second bridge came lower and later, made of concrete with a cracked rail and a creek slipping beneath it in brown, glassy movement. On the far side, a farm dog began barking from somewhere unseen. It had a deep hoarse bark, the kind made by an animal old enough to distrust change, but too dutiful to ignore it. A house stood back behind a windbreak of spruce, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, upright line. At the mailbox, an elderly man in a canvas coat paused while pulling letters free. He watched Hannah pass, then looked toward the road behind her as if expecting a car to explain her. Finding none, he touched the brim of his cap. She touched 2 fingers to her forehead in answer. Walnut trees appeared just where the clerk had promised. They grew along the left side of the road, black-limbed and muscular. Their leaves mostly fallen, their green-black hulls scattered in the ditch like bruised fruit. Behind them, set back farther than Hannah expected, stood the Hawley Bend post office. For a moment, she did not cross the ditch. The building was modest, perhaps 24 feet wide and 38 feet deep, 1.5 stories if one counted the low attic tucked beneath the roof pitch. It had been built of cream brick darkened by soot and weather, with a limestone foundation visible where the soil had washed away near the southwest corner. The roof was cedar shake under patches of corrugated tin, both failing in different languages. A single brick chimney rose from the rear slope, cracked near the crown and capped by a rusted piece of sheet metal wired in place. The porch ran the width of the front, shallow and sagging, its turned posts grey with rot at the bases. Above the door hung the sign, Hawley Bend, U.S. Post Office. The letters had once been black. Now they were faded into a soft charcoal, but the words remained legible, held on a plank so weathered that the grain stood raised beneath the paint. Beneath the sign, nailed crookedly to the door, was a county notice in orange paper, blistered from rain. Condemned. N.O. Occupancy. Demolition pending. Hannah stood in the ditch with her envelope under one arm and Amos's saw against her ribs. It was not beautiful in any easy way. The glass in the right front window had cracked from corner to corner. The left front window had no glass at all, only cardboard buckled inward and stained by weather. Ivy had climbed one side wall and died there, leaving a brown net of stems clinging to the mortar. The gutters hung loose. The front step had split down the middle. Still, the building faced the road. That mattered to Hannah. It had not turned away. She crossed the ditch where the grass lay flattened, placed 1 foot on the edge of the porch, and pressed carefully. The board bowed. She stepped back, moved to the left, where the joist seemed stronger, and tested again. This time it held. Each board complained under her weight, but did not break. At the door, the brass key worked only after she lifted the knob hard with one hand and turned with the other. The lock gave way with a dry click. The smell came first. Cold paper, mouse droppings, damp wood, old dust, a faint ghost of coal smoke from winters when someone had kept a stove burning in the rear room. Beneath it all lingered a scent Hannah could not name at once. Something metallic and dry, like pennies kept in a drawer. She pushed the door inward. Light entered behind her and fell across the front room in a long rectangle. Dust moved through it slowly. The public area remained almost intact. A service counter ran along the right wall, oak beneath peeling varnish. with a high writing ledge where customers had once filled out money orders, addressed parcels, and pressed stamps onto envelopes with damp thumbs. 3 brass post office boxes were set into the wall behind the counter, their little combination dials green with age. Most of the boxes had been removed, leaving square shadows where metal had protected paint from time. On the left wall, a bulletin board still held curled notices beneath clouded glass: rural route changes, holiday hours, a yellowed poster about zip codes. The floor was tongue-and-groove pine, dirty but not ruined except near the missing window where rain had darkened the boards to the colour of strong tea. The silence inside was not empty. It was layered. Hannah closed the door gently and listened. Something skittered inside a wall. A drop of water fell in the back room. Wind pushed along the eaves and found a thin whistle near the roofline. Far off, the farm dog barked once more, then decided she belonged to the landscape for now. She stepped behind the counter. The back room was colder. Here the roof damage showed itself in stained plaster and a soft place near the far wall where ceiling lath had fallen in strips. Wooden sorting shelves covered one side, each cubby labelled by hand in ink now faded brown. Bender, Kozlovsky, Granger, Whiteacre. Hannah stopped. The name was written on a strip of paper tucked beneath a brass tab, the letters uneven but deliberate. Whitaker. She did not touch it. Not yet. Her breath showed faintly in the air, and the sight of those letters did what the clerk's recognition had not. It made the day tilt. She looked away before tears could become another task. There was a pot-bellied stove in the corner, black and squat, with one broken mica window and a stovepipe rising into the chimney. Mrs. Kozlowski had warned her not to use. Beside it stood a metal bucket half full of grey ash, hardened by damp. A narrow door at the rear opened with the second key after several tries, revealing weeds pressed against the threshold and a view of the creek beyond the property, moving between leafless willows. Hannah found the cellar door under a hooked rug, stiff with dirt. She did not open it. She only lifted one edge, saw the iron ring set into the boards, and let the rug fall back. Granite steps, wet, uneven. Not today. She made her first inventory in the spiral notebook before dark. Front door works if lifted. Rear door swollen. Lock works. Roof failing rear left. Chimney unsafe. Windows front left open. Front right cracked. Floor soft near window. Water none found. Electric none. Stove do not use. Cellar unopened. Animals mice likely. She added one more line after a long pause. Name in sorting shelf. Whitaker. Evening came early in the hollow by 4:30. Light had thinned to a pewter colour, and cold began rising from the floorboards as if the cellar were breathing upward. Hannah used cardboard from the broken window to cover the worst gap, wedging it with a piece of fallen lath. She swept mouse droppings from one corner with a bundle of dried grass tied together by twine found on the sorting table. There was no broom, no lamp, no blanket beyond the coat she wore. She ate the last 2 crackers while sitting behind the counter, knees drawn up, listening to the building settle into night. The first stars appeared through the missing pane before she remembered she had not arranged for anyone to check on her. The thought should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, it felt honest. Nobody knew where she was except a clerk who had once received a college letter from a careful mailman. The world had narrowed to a condemned post office, a folded deed, 2 keys, a saw, and the breath in her chest. After dark, the cold became exact. She lay on the floor behind the counter because that corner seemed driest. She wrapped the purse strap around her wrist, set the saw beneath her coat, and placed the brown envelope under her shoulder so no mouse could chew it. Her hip found every ridge in the pine boards. Her feet would not warm. Wind pressed against the cardboard window covering and released it, again pressed and released like someone considering whether to come in. Sleep did not arrive all at once. It came in scraps. Once she woke to the sound of walnut hulls dropping outside, each one landing with a dull, patient knock. Once she woke because a mouse had crossed her sleeve. Once she woke because the building made a low groan in the roof, and she waited in the dark for collapse, counting her breaths until the silence settled. Near midnight, clouds moved off the moon. A pale bar of light entered through the cracked glass and reached across the floorboards to the service counter. It touched the brass post office boxes, the curled notices, the old sorting shelf, and finally the paper label bearing her mother's people's name, Whitaker. The letters waited in the moonlight with the calm of things that had been there before her fear and would remain after it. Hannah did not pray. She did not make a promise. Promises felt too large for the room and too easy to break. Instead, she reached one hand from beneath her coat and laid her palm flat on the floor. The house had been waiting, and so had she. Morning entered through cardboard and cracked glass. Grey first, then blue along the edges, and Hannah woke with one cheek pressed to pine boards so cold they seemed made of stone. For a moment she did not move. The room was still there. The roof had not fallen. The front door remained shut. Her breath lifted faintly from her mouth and disappeared above her face. Somewhere in the wall a mouse worked at something dry and private, chewing with the tiny confidence of a creature whose family had held the building longer than she had. She sat up slowly because stiffness had settled into her hips and shoulder during the night. The envelope beneath her had bent at one corner but remained whole. Her fingers ached when she unwrapped them from the purse strap. She placed the deed copy flat on the counter and smoothed it with both palms. Not from ceremony exactly, but because paper could become damaged if neglected, and this was now the one paper that said she belonged indoors somewhere. The first 3 days taught her what the building would and would not give. It would give shelter from rain if she stayed out of the rear left corner. It would give a door that latched if lifted hard and pulled toward the hinge. It would give a floor that spoke honestly beneath weight, every board with its own warning. The plank nearest the front left window answered with a hollow dip. The board behind the counter gave a short squeak at the nail line. The backroom threshold clicked once, not loudly, but always, if crossed near the right jamb. She learned these sounds as carefully as she had once learned bus schedules. Water was the first problem. The creek behind the post office ran brown and clear in different places, but she did not trust it without boiling, and the chimney was unsafe, and she had no pot except a dented coffee can found on a shelf under the service counter. On the first morning she followed the creek upstream until she found a farm lane, and beyond it, a hand pump standing near an empty milk house with half its roof gone. The pump handle resisted, then coughed, then brought up water rusty at first and clean after several strokes. She filled her bottle and the coffee can, listening between pumps for any voice that might ask what she was doing. No one came. She found the outhouse the second day, behind a tangle of dead burdock and sumac, its door hanging from one hinge and a crescent moon cut into the upper panel. A wasp nest, vacant and grey, clung to one corner beneath the roof. The seat was weathered smooth, the floorboards held. She cleaned it with leaves, creek sand, and a kind of patience that had no dignity in it but did have purpose. By evening she had cut a path to it with the saw, not because a dovetail saw was meant for brush, but because it was the blade she had. On the third day, rain came. It began before dawn and found the roof's weaknesses with the calm accuracy of a surveyor. Drops fell into the back room through 3 places, each with a different rhythm. One into the ash bucket beside the stove, one onto a sorting shelf labelled Granger, one into the soft corner near the collapsed lath where water had already made a dark map across the plaster wall. Hannah set out what she had: the coffee can, a cracked glass jar, a metal drawer pulled from beneath the counter. She moved them as the leaks shifted. There was no romance in damp socks. By noon, she had written 2 pages in the notebook. Not feelings, measurements. Front room width, 23 feet, 8 inches. Counter length, 14 feet, 2 inches. Back room depth, 16 feet, 9 inches. Window openings, 30 inches by 54. Stovepipe, 6 inch. Roof pitch, estimated, steep enough to kill a careless person. She wrote the last line, stared at it, and crossed out kill. Steep enough to punish. The rain stopped before evening. Cold returned with a sharper edge. Hannah walked back to town the following morning because a building could be listened to for only so long before work required nails, rope, tar paper, and someone who knew where they were kept. Abel's Hardware stood on the south side of the square between the pharmacy and a narrow insurance office. A bell rang when she entered, clearer than the clerk's bell and less tired. The store smelled of oiled metal, seed packets, pine dust, kerosene and coffee kept warm too long. Wooden drawers lined one wall from knee-height to above Hannah's head, each with a brass pull and a small card, naming what lived inside: hinge screws, brass tacks, cotter pins, stove bolts, finishing nails, washers, glazing points. Shovel handles stood in a barrel near the door. Rope hung from ceiling hooks. A glass case held pocket knives, padlocks, and sharpening stones. Behind the counter stood a man with one cloudy blue eye and one brown one, as if two different weathers had settled into his face. He was tall but stooped slightly at the neck. His grey beard had been trimmed with scissors rather than a barber's hand, and his plaid shirt sleeves were buttoned at the wrist, despite the store's heat. He was reading an order sheet through square glasses, low on his nose. "Morning," he said, without looking up. "Morning." He finished his line, made a mark with a carpenter's pencil, and then raised his head. "You are the post office girl." Hannah held still. "Word walks faster than people," he said. "I am Abel Soren. Hannah Reed. I know." There was no accusation in it. He came around the counter and moved with the careful economy of a man whose knees had given notice years earlier but had not yet been granted retirement. He looked at her shoes, the frayed cuffs of her jeans, the sore wrapped under one arm, and then back at her face. "What are you fixing first?" "The roof." "Eventually. But today I need to stop water from coming in. And cover a window." "Eventually" is a dangerous word with November rain, inside a place that belonged to her. She washed the can with sand and creek water after dark, then dried it carefully near the stove until the last of the fire had gone to coals. The following day, with weather held off and the chimney only partly trusted, Hannah turned to the workroom. Inventory steadied her. It made ruin less personal. She began at the door and moved clockwise, noting each item as if recording an estate that might someday be questioned by people not yet born. North wall sorting case. 12 columns. 9 rows. Several labels legible. Bender. Koesluski. Granger. Larson. Waitaka. Rarrell High. Perks. 3 cubbies contain twine. 1 contains mouse nest. 1 contains envelopes eaten along edges. East wall wooden table. 6 feet. 1 drawer stuck. 1 leg shortened with folded cardboard shim. On table postal scale. Capacity 4 pounds. Brass pan missing. Ink bottle dry. Rubber stamp handles. 6. Faces cracked. String dispenser. Iron. Usable. 2 pencils. No erasers. South wall pot-bellied stove. Ash bucket. Broken chair. Collapsed crate marked fragile in red. Stack of canvas mail sacks. Rotted along bottom seams. 1 sack marked US. Emile property. Do not remove. West wall service counter rear. Under shelves. 3 drawers. Drawer 1 forms. Morning Chin Tam Misao. Drawer 2 stamps cancelled. No value. Drawer 3 receipts. Mouse damaged. Lower cabinet locked. Key not found. She worked with deliberate slowness, not because she expected treasure, but because Amos had taught her that haste broke what age had merely weakened. The stuck drawer on the wooden table opened after she ran a knife blade along the top edge and tapped the side with her palm. Inside lay carbon paper, brittle rubber bands, a wooden ruler, and a postcard of the Iowa State Fair never mailed. The locked lower cabinet beneath the service counter bothered her. Not because it promised anything, because it did not match the rest. Most doors in the building had surrendered to weather. The rear door swelled and stuck, the cellar hatch wore a rusted ring, the sorting shelves stood open to dust and mice. But the lower cabinet, set back under the customer counter near where a postmaster's sneeze would have fit, remained tight. Its oak door showed no handle, only a small brass escutcheon darkened by time. Hannah tried the first brass key, then the rear door key neither turned. She left it alone. That evening, while sweeping behind the counter with her tied grass broom, the hammer slipped from the ledge and struck the cabinet front near the floor. The sound was wrong. Not wood. Not hollow exactly. A dull, thick note answered from behind the oak, heavier than the surrounding panels. Hannah stopped with the broom in both hands. She tapped the counterside. Wood. She tapped the cabinet door. Wood over something. She tapped the narrow kick plate beneath it. There. The sound changed. Low and dense, as if the old post office had swallowed a smaller room made of metal. Hannah set down the broom. Sound first. Amos would have said. Then wait. Then seam. She ran her fingers along the kick plate, pressing through dust and hardened grime. A vertical line appeared near the left end, too straight to be a crack. Another at the right. The centre panel had been made to lift out, but paint and dirt had sealed it in place. She worked the utility knife along the edges. The blade snapped. She replaced it and kept going. Paint came away in chips the colour of old cream. Beneath the lower lip, her fingertip found a small half-moon knot. She pulled. Nothing. She wedged the knife, then the ruler, then the bent scraper. The panel moved a breath. She waited. Not because she was calm, but because forcing it now would splinter to the oak. She warmed the edge with her palms. She tapped upward with the hammer handle, once, twice, then again from the other side. The panel loosened suddenly and dropped into her hands with a soft. Behind it sat a round cedar disc, fitted into a metal recess. The disc was about the size of a dinner plate, darkened by age but still faintly fragrant when she leaned close. At its centre was a small brass knob, no larger than a thimble. Around the edge someone had cut 3 shallow notches at uneven intervals, not decorative, a grip pattern, or a code, or simply the solution of a practical person who needed fingers to hold where fingers had no room. Hannah touched the disc and felt how cold the metal around it remained. She tested weight by pressing gently inward. The disc did not move. She turned the brass knob clockwise. Nothing. Counter-clockwise. A soft grit sound. She stopped and swept dust from the lower edge with the corner of a rag. There, almost hidden, were 2 words stamped into the metal lip. Her pulse changed then. Not fast in a clean way. Uneven. As if her body had stepped forward while the rest of her remained kneeling on the floor. She looked toward the front window, where late daylight shone through plastic. No one stood outside. No truck had come up the road. No voice waited behind the door. The building held its silence. Registered mail had needed security. Money orders. Documents. Parcels someone had paid extra to protect. A sealed compartment under a post office counter was not impossible. It was practical. But practical things, forgotten long enough, became mysteries without trying. She did not have the key. She found it 2 hours later. Not in the drawers, not behind the sorting case, not on the table under forms or inside the cracked postal scale. She found it inside the string dispenser after she noticed the spindle did not turn. The iron lid lifted only when she pressed a spring tab near the back. Inside, wrapped in wax paper and tied with thread blackened by age, lay a flat steel key with a barrel end and a tag so faded the writing had nearly disappeared. R.S. Meng. Hannah sat down on the floor, key in hand. Outside, evening thickened. The room had gone cold because she had let the stove die while searching. Her knees hurt from kneeling. Soot still darkened the lines of her palms. She should have waited until morning. Every careful thing in her knew that. She did not wait. The key entered the lock hidden behind the cedar disc's brass knob. It resisted at first, then seated with a deep exact fit that felt less like opening and more like being recognized. She turned it slowly, 1/4, half, a full turn. Inside the compartment, something mechanical shifted after decades of stillness, a heavy tongue withdrawing through dust. The cedar disc loosened. Hannah lifted it free. Behind it was a steel door no larger than a cupboard front, with a recessed handle folded flat against the surface. She pulled the handle down. The hinges resisted, then opened with a long, dry complaint. Air moved out from inside, stale and mineral, carrying cedar metal paper and the sealed sweetness of time kept from damp. The compartment was deeper than she expected. Not large, but full. 3 canvas mail sacks lay folded inside, each tied vacapitaire cotton cord and sealed with red wax impressed by an official stamp. Beside them sat a narrow wooden box, a tin cash box with black paint worn at the corners and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. At the very back, leaning against the steel wall, was something long in a leather sheath. Hannah did not reach in at once. She sat back on her heels and listened to her own breathing. Then she removed the first item, the oilcloth bundle, because it was nearest and because cloth could be opened without breaking a seal. The wrapping had been tied with linen tape. She loosened the knot, unfolded one layer, then another. Inside lay tools, not postal tools, craft tools. A small brass caliper, a pair of hand-forged shears, wrapped together in paper, a burnisher with a handle of dark walnut, a bone folder, yellowed smooth, needles in a corked glass tube, a spool of waxed linen thread, still usable at the centre where air had not reached, a steel awl whose handle had been shaped by a palm long gone. Each tool had been oiled before storage. Whoever had wrapped them had expected time to pass but not destroy. Hannah set them on the floor one by one, aligning them without meaning to, as Amos would have done. The wooden box came next. It was cedar as well, dovetailed at the corners, the joinery so fine that Hannah touched it twice before opening the lid. Inside were raw materials wrapped in brown paper, sheets of thin calfskin, dried but not ruined, squares of linen, packets of gold leaf between tissue, a small jar of powdered pigment labelled lampblack, another labelled red ochre, cakes of beeswax, a roll of marbled paper, its colours hidden until she lifted one edge and saw blue, rust, cream and green moving together like creek water over stones. Bookbinding, she realised. Or something near it. Not cabinet making. Not exactly. But close in spirit. Paper. Leather. Thread. Boards. Pressure. Patience. The repair of what carried words. She laughed once then, but it was not amusement. It was a breath that had no other door. The tin cash box was heavier than its size suggested. It had its own smoky tape beneath the lid, as if the person who stored it had wanted it found by anyone careful enough to look, but not by anyone careless enough to pry. Inside were money orders, folded currency, coin rolls, and loose coins wrapped in paper cones. A ledger lay on top, its cover black, its corners softened. Hannah did not count immediately. She opened the ledger first. Names, dates, amounts, not large, at least not at first glance, $7, $12, 43 cents, a money order for $25, cash held for pickup, registered parcels logged and not claimed, return instructions marked pending. Then, later pages, written in a different hand, entries moved under a heading, undelivered, hold safe. 3 canvas sacks waited beside her knee. The seals remained intact. She looked at the wax impressed with the post office mark. Hawley Bend, Iowa. The year on one seal was Maninchen Tamisau. Another Morchanchin Tammi Bay. The third had cracked across the date, but not enough to open. Hannah had never felt so aware of her hands. She could open them. She owned the building, but did she own Vacep Hate had been entrusted to the post office? Did abandonment erase obligation? Did a letter grow ownerless because its sender had died, its receiver moved, its route disappeared, its clerk forgotten? Amos' voice, or the memory of his voice, did not answer for her. He had never liked easy morality. He would have told her to identify the work first. The work was not spending. The work was care. She left the sacks sealed. The long leather sheath at the back held a military medal wrapped in tissue and a folded note too brittle to open in fading light. The medal was bronze, dark and almost brown, suspended from a ribbon striped in colours dulled by age. On the back, engraved in careful block letters, was the name Elias Whitaker. Beneath it, Born to. Hannah held it only a moment before setting it down on the oilcloth. Her hands had begun to shake. Now she counted, because the cash box required record. Not desire. Record. She made columns in the notebook and went slowly. Currency first, ones, fives, tens, a few 20s so old their faces seemed stern with disapproval. Total $486. Money orders, 3 uncashed, one for $18.75, one for $42, one for $9.30. Payees listed. Dates old. Validity uncertain. Coin rolls, pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, some wrappers printed by a bank that no longer existed under that name. Loose coins, wheat pennies, silver dimes, 2 buffalo nickels, a standing Liberty quarter with the date nearly worn away, and 1 Muchin Salmi 2 Kennedy $half sealed in a small envelope marked for Eddie S. birthday. She counted twice. Then a third time because numbers deserved honesty. The total in currency and coin, not including money orders, was $612.87. $612.87. Enough to change the next week. Not enough to make a life careless. Enough for food. Nails. Winter. Perhaps a proper kettle. Perhaps boots that did not admit water at the seams. Enough to tempt a hungry person into calling it Providence and closing the ledger before the names could speak. Hannah wrote the amount down. Then she wrote not mine until known. The room darkened while she sat there among tools, sealed mail sacks, old currency, and a medal bearing her bloodline S name. She did not open the folded note. She did not open the brittle letter tucked beneath the medal. She could feel its presence without reading it, and that was already too much for one evening. Some things asked to be approached in daylight after hands had been washed, and a fire built, and the mind made less frantic by hunger. She returned everything except the tools to the compartment, but not as she had found it. She placed the cash box on the floor beside her bed corner. Then she changed her mind and put it back into the safe. Then she changed her mind again, removed the ledger, and placed only the ledger beneath her coat. After several minutes, she returned the ledger too. Order mattered. Trust mattered. She closed the steel door, set the cedar disc in place, but did not lock it. The safe had waited 40 years. It could wait one more night without pretending not to exist. Outside, the air had turned still. Hannah stepped through the rear door and stood behind the post office as dusk settled over the creek. The water moved darkly between the willows, carrying leaves caught flat against its surface. Beyond it, fields lifted into a low ridge where stubble shone faintly under the last light. No house window faced her from that direction. No road sound reached the hollow. The world seemed to have drawn back, giving the building and the girl a little room. She walked to the creek bank and crouched there, arms wrapped around her knees. The money frightened her less than the letters. Money could be counted, tools could be named, a medal could be researched, but letters were arrivals interrupted. They were voices held in the throat of time. Somewhere, perhaps, there had been a mother waiting for a son's reply, a daughter waiting for a birthday envelope, a widow waiting for paperwork, a veteran waiting for recognition, a farmer waiting for payment, a child waiting beside a mailbox until waiting became a habit, and then a wound. Hannah picked up a flat stone and held it. She did not throw it. The creek kept moving, brown and cold and exact, around roots under fallen branches, past the old post office that had once stood for delivery and had become instead a keeper of delay. Behind her, through the rear doorway, the dark shape of the counter waited. Beneath it, the safe waited. Inside the safe, the unopened sacks waited with their wax seals intact. She stayed outside until her fingers numbed around the stone. Then she set it down where she had found it, returned to the building, and lay behind the counter without lighting the stove. Sleep came late. When it did, it was shallow and crowded by the sound of paper shifting in places where there was no wind. The house had been waiting, and so had she. By morning, the cold had made the safe handle painful to touch. Hannah warmed her hands over a brief fire before she opened it again, feeding the stove with twigs no longer than her wrist and watching each seam as if the iron might change its mind. Smoke drew clean enough for a half-hour, and that was all she allowed. Heat entered the room in a thin, temporary way, touching the counter, the floor, the old labels, the place where she had slept. Verkepp had her coat pulled over her chin. She washed her hands in creek water from the coffee can until the soot and metal dust loosened from the lines of her palms. Then she dried them on the least dirty corner of a rag. Paper deserved that much. So did the dead. The letter lay beneath the medal, folded twice and tied with a faded blue ribbon. The envelope had never been sealed. It had only been tucked around the pages, one épée folded into the other, the way a person might close something meant to be opened by family rather than delivered by a The handwriting stopped her before she read a single word. She had seen its shape in Amos' old address book, in labels on jars, in the penciled notes he made beside repairs he expected someone to finish later. Not the same hand, older, more formal, but related somehow in the slant, in the patient downward pull of certain letters, in the way the capital W seemed to begin before the pen touched paper. Whittaker handwriting. Hannah sat behind the counter with her back against the oak and unfolded the pages along their original creases. My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has come into your hands, then the house has outlasted me, and likely many things Mott once believed would continue without interruption. Mott will not ask your name, because Mott cannot know it. Mott will not ask whether you are man or woman, young or old, near kin or far kin, though Mott confess Mott have hoped, in my private and foolish hours, that some hand of our blood might one day open this paper with care. My name is Clara May Whittaker. Mort was born Clara May Ellison on March Morchin outside Lansing, Iowa, in a room above my father's harness shop, where leather scraps were swept into the stove each night, and every winter coat in town smelled faintly of neatsfoot oil. Mort married Samuel Reed Whittaker in June of Morchin Mort, when the fields were poor and hope had to be measured like flour. We made our life here at Hawley Bend, first in the cottage beyond the walnut trees, and later in the rooms behind the post office, where Samuel carried mail, sold stamps, repaired ledgers, bound account books, and taught me the trade his mother had learned before him. Mortem writing because Dr. Harold Voss at the hospital in Rochester has told me plainly what my own body had already begun to say. The growth in my breast has gone into places a knife cannot reach. He was kind enough not to dress the words in lace. Mott have 6 months, perhaps fewer, and Mott find that the mind becomes most orderly when the body begins to fail. There are cupboards to empty, accounts to settle, tools to oil, and instructions to leave for a person Mott will not meet. This trade did not begin with me. Your first known Whittaker in this line was Thomas Whittaker, born in Morhintam near Bath, England, apprenticed at 14 to a binder of church registers and law books. He crossed to America in Morhintam and came west by stages, carrying 2 awls, a brass finishing tool, and a press screw wrapped in sacking. His son, Elias Thomas Whittaker, born in Mortamsau in Galena, Illinois, brought the family into Iowa after the war years and set type for county notices before he married Anna Bell, a schoolteacher whose copybooks he bound by hand. Their son, Samuel Reed Whittaker, my husband, was born in Mortamshin near Decorah and learned both mail and binding because a rural man often needed 2 honest trades to keep one family fed. Samuel and Mort had one son, Elias Samuel Whittaker, named for his grandfather and great-grandfather. He had hands quick enough for stitching and too restless for the life that made him. He enlisted after Pearl Harbor and died in France in Mortninchin-Bontu near Saint-Lô before his 23rd birthday. His medal is wrapped with this letter because Mott could not bear to hang it on a wall and dust it like decoration. My brother Daniel was taken by influenza in Mortninchin at Camp Dodge before he ever crossed the ocean. My husband lived through the First War only because the mail service kept him stateside with a heart murmur the army would not accept, And yet grief came for this house all the same. It always found the road. The date that closed the trade here was October Bay Morchin Nammihai. Mort remember because frost had silvered the pumpkins behind the Granger barn, and because that morning Samuel tried to lift a full mail sack and dropped it. The stroke took his right side first, then his speech. He lived 3 more years, but his hands never returned to the bench. Mott bound 2 account ledgers that winter, repaired 3 hymnals for Reverend Caskey, and finished a family Bible for Mrs. Bender, whose children had scattered to Oregon, Kansas, and the Navy. After that, the work slowed, and Mott let it slow. Mott told people Mott was busy with postal accounts. That was not the truth. The truth is that without Samuel's voice in the room, the tools sounded too loud. 30 years have passed since Mort last taught anyone the full method. 30 years of keeping the press covered, the knives honed, the skins wrapped against damp, the thread waxed, and the paper flat. Mott told myself there would be time. Then Mott told myself there would be no student. Both were excuses with proper shoes on. So Mott am leaving what Mott can. If you mean to practice the binding, begin not with a Bible, nor with any book beloved by a living person. Begin ver kepi tehat blank sections. Fold by hand, always grain with spine never against it. 4 sheets to a section for ordinary paper, 6 if the stock is thin. Pierce the sewing stations with an awl at equal measure, not by guess, and keep your kettle of paste warm but never hot enough to sour. Wheat paste should be cooked to a patient gloss, 1 part flour to 4 parts water, stirred without leaving the pot. Hide glue must not boil. Keep it between 140 and 150 degrees, or you will kill its strength and smell your error before you. For leather, dampen slowly from the flesh side, never soak. It should yield under the folder but not darken through. Pare the turn-ins thin as onion skin, especially at the corners, and remember that a corner tells on the whole hand. Boards must be square before beauty is considered. Press between clean blotters, change them after the first hour, then again before night. Leave the book under weight, longer than impatience allows. 24 hours is little, 48 is honest. When tooling, heat the brass only until it hisses faintly against a damp scrap. Too cold and the mark will lie dull, too hot and it will scorch like pride. If these instructions seem severe, forgive me. They are not meant to frighten you. They are meant to spare you waste. Good material is not cheap. More than that, good material was once alive. Whether tree, flax, calf, or hand, treat it accordingly. Mort do not know what inheritance means anymore. We speak as if it were money, land, silver spoons, or a name people recognize on courthouse paper. Mort have seen all such things scatter. Money feeds the nearest need and then is gone. Land is taxed, divided, flooded, sold, or taken by those with cleaner boots and sharper pens. A name can be carried by people who do not know what hands built beneath it. Perhaps inheritance is only this. One person keeps something from ruin long enough that another person may choose whether to keep it too. If you are hungry, use the cash. If you are cold, use it. If the roof is open, buy shingles before you buy thread. Moat would rather see the place warm and mended than see a box of coins guarded by pride. But do not spend what belongs to another if you can help it. The sacks in the registered safe are not ours in any simple way. They contain letters, payments, orders, and griefs that lost their road when Hawley Bend lost its office. If there is any strength in you for the work, find where they were meant to go. If the people are gone, find their children. If the children are gone, mark the names and keep the record honest. There is a marker outside if you need to know whether you stand in the right place. Behind the house, past the wash line, the old walnut took a horseshoe into its bark the summer Elias was born. It will be high now if the tree is living. Samuel nailed it there for luck, though he claimed not to believe in such things. Mott have left 1 candle in the blue box. It was poured the winter after Elias died. From beeswax Samuel traded for binding work. Mott never burned it. Mott was saving it for a day when the house felt less empty. That day did not come for me. Maybe it has come for you. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Hawley Bend, Iowa, August Bar, Motnin Chin Tammy Bar. Hannah read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, more slowly, stopping where the ink had pressed harder, where the pen had hesitated, where Clara May had corrected one word by striking a single line through it instead of tearing the page away. The room around her seemed changed not by revelation, but by population. Names stood in it now: Thomas, Elias, Samuel, Clara, Daniel, a son buried far from the creek, a husband lifting a mail sack on a frost morning, a woman keeping tools oiled for 30 years because she could not teach and could not throw them away. Hannah folded the pages along their original creases. She did it carefully. First the lower half, then the upper. The blue ribbon had weakened, so she did not retie it. She laid it beside the medal and rested one hand over both until the chill of the bronze entered her palm. Outside, daylight had strengthened. She rose stiffly, took the letter, and went through the rear door toward the walnut trees behind the building, frost still held in shaded grass. The creek moved beyond the willows with a low, steady sound. Past the rusted washline posts, past a patch of burdock, past a scatter of black walnut shells crushed by deer, she found the tree. It was larger than she expected, the trunk wide enough that two people could not have joined hands around it. The bark had folded and ridged with age, black in the grooves, silver on the high places where weather had polished it. At first she saw nothing. Then, standing on a root and looking higher, she found the curve of iron half swallowed by living wood. A horseshoe. Only the outer arc remained visible. The nails had vanished into the trunk, and the bark had risen around the iron like water frozen mid-motion. It was well above her head now. Samuel had nailed it low for a newborn child, and time had lifted it where no hand could reach without a ladder. Hannah stood beneath it a long while. She did not touch the tree. She only looked up at Morph the iron held in bark and thought of a man pretending not to believe in luck, doing the work anyway. Back inside, she searched the safe for the blue box. It was behind the tool bundle, narrower than a cigar box, painted once in a colour that had faded almost to grey. The latch opened easily. Inside lay a single beeswax candle wrapped in linen, its surface bloomed white with age. It smelled faintly sweet when Hannah lifted it out, not like perfume, but like summer stored under winter for too long. The wick had darkened, the wax bore a thumbprint near the base, perhaps Clara May's, perhaps Samuel's, perhaps only the mark of whoever had poured and cooled and wrapped it. Hannah set the candle in an empty ink bottle because there was no holder. She placed it on the service counter, between the brass post office boxes and the ledger. Then she waited until late afternoon, when the room had begun its daily darkening and the plastic over the window turned silver. She struck a match from the small box Abel had tucked beside the oatmeal. The first match broke. The second flared, sulphur-sharp in the cold air. She held it to the wick. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the old beeswax accepted flame, and a small, steady light rose from something saved too long for a day that had finally arrived. It did not brighten the room much. That was not its work. It made a circle, countertop, letter, medal, tools. Hannah's chapped hands. Beyond the circle the post office remained in shadow, with its open cubbies and stained ceiling and sealed sacks still waiting beneath steel. The candle burned without drama, its flame no taller than her thumbnail, but it altered the room more completely than a lamp could have done. Electric light would have made the building visible. This made it attended. Hannah sat before it until the wax pooled clear near the wick. She thought then of the chain that had brought her there, though no one in the chain had known what they were making. The woman in the red coat at the bus station who had given crackers without requiring confession. The Methodist volunteer in Manchester who had placed a warm towel at the foot of a cot and then walked away before thanks could become embarrassing. The librarian who photocopied township maps and did not ask for coins. Mrs. Kozlowski, who remembered Amos not as history but as a man standing in a lane with a college letter. Abel Soren, who had opened a credit account for someone whose total worth could be held in one hand. None of them had saved her life in a manner worth a newspaper line. They had only done small things in the correct direction. A cracker, a towel, a photocopy, a key, a manual, a sentence without judgment. For anyone listening tonight, maybe you know a kindness like that. Not the grand kind people tell at banquets, but the small, almost hidden one that arrived when your hands were full and your name felt thin. A ride offered in bad weather. A bill paid quietly. A neighbour who shoveled the walk before dawn and never mentioned it. A teacher who saw you were hungry and called it extra lunch. If you remember one, write it down in the comments. Not for praise, for witness. Some kindnesses stay alive only because somebody finally says they happen. The candle burned lower. Hannah did not let it burn to the end. Clara May had saved it 60 years. Hannah could save part of it too. She pinched the flame with damp fingers and felt the brief bite of heat. Smoke lifted, blue and thin, carrying the smell of beeswax and extinguished wick into the room. Then she arranged the things beside her sleeping place, as if preparing for a night watch. The tools wrapped again in oilcloth but not hidden, the letter folded and placed on top of the blue box, the medal beside it, face upward, the ledger near her shoulder, the safe door closed but not locked. The 3 sealed mail sacks still inside, their wax marks intact, waiting for daylight, for records, for roads, for the careful work Clara May had named without softening. Hannah lay down behind the counter with the coat over her legs, and Amos S. saw beneath her hand. For the first time since the kitchen sink and the rain-dark street and the closed door behind her, she did not count what remained in her purse before sleeping. The arithmetic had changed. Not because she had become safe, she had not. The roof still leaked, the chimney still needed work, the window still held only plastic, and winter was coming over Iowa with its long, indifferent hands. But the room around her was no longer only a condemned post office. It was a house of interrupted arrivals. It was a workshop. It was a record. It was a question placed in her keeping by a woman who had waited beyond death for someone careful enough to open a sealed compartment and not mistake possession for ownership. Outside, the walnut tree held its iron. The creek moved in the dark. The old building settled once, softly, as if lowering itself around her. Hannah slept with the heirlooms beside her, and for several hours, nothing in the room was lost. The first snow came on December ba. Just before daylight, 4 inches laid over the road, the ditch, the porch boards, and the walnut hulls like a white cloth pulled across a patient body. Hannah woke because the room had gone too hushed. Snow changed a building before it changed the ground. It softened the wind against the window plastic. It pressed on the roof without footsteps. It made every leak wait for thaw, which was not the same as mercy, only postponement. She stood beneath the rear slope and listened to the sea. No dripping yet, no crack of rafter, no sudden giving way. By noon the clouds lifted, and the sun showed every weakness. From the road the roof looked worse under snow because the sag was outlined cleanly. The cedar shakes had failed along the back left quarter where water had been entering for years. Corrugated tin, nailed over part of the damage by some past county hand, had lifted at one corner and now held snow in a shallow pocket. The ridgeline dipped near the chimney. Along the eave, icicles had already begun forming where heat from inside should not have been reaching, though Hannah knew her little fires had not caused that. The roof had been losing itself long before she arrived. She read the roofing chapter in Abel S. Manual 3 times. The first reading was for fear. The second was for words. The third was for sequence. Decking. Felt. Drip edge. Starter course. Exposure. Flashing. Ridge cap. Sister rafter. Chalk line. Staggered joints. Nail above the seal line. Not through it. Keep courses straight because every crooked beginning multiplies itself toward the ridge. She measured from inside first, standing on the back room table because she still did not trust the cellar steps and had no ladder tall enough for the outside slope. Rafter spacing roughly 24 inches on centre, though the old building had not been made to please modern manuals. Damaged area 12 feet wide by 16 feet up the slope, plus uncertain rot near the chimney. Full roof's about 24 by 20. She dérêvé kept it in the notebook, then drew it again more neatly. Abel let her use the store S phone to call the county salvage yard. No, they did not have cedar shakes. Yes, they had half bundles of asphalt shingles from storm repairs, mismatched colours, 3-tabbed, still dry. $6 per bundle if she hauled them herself. Roofing felt was $12 a roll, too much for her, until Abel found a partial roll behind the lumber rack and called it 5. Galvanized roofing nails, 1¼ inch, a full box she could not afford, so he weighed out 2 pounds on the hardware scale and wrote $1.80 on her account. "You are not roofing alone," he said. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet. Its head dark, its handle rubbed almost black where another hand had gripped it for years. One side held a blade. The other held a square hammer face. A little gauge notch had been filed into the edge. "My brother Len used that," Abel said. "Before his hip went and before his lungs followed. He roofed half the barns between here and Mabel." "You are not taking. You are using." He placed it on the counter. The hatchet had a nick near the blade and a leather thong through the handle. Hannah put her fingers around it and felt at once the difference between a tool made for a purpose and a thing bought because nothing better was available. It had weight in the head, not the handle. It wanted to fall cleanly. It wanted a nail. That afternoon, Abel sent word through channels Hannah never fully understood, and the next morning a man named Vernon Pike walked up Hawley Bend Road carrying a ladder on one shoulder. He was 72, former roofer, former farmer, former smoker judging by his cough, and current keeper of opinions he distributed without decoration. He wore an army field jacket, insulated coveralls, and a knit cap pulled low over ears that looked carved from red clay. His eyebrows were white and wild, his eyes were small and dark, quick to notice every poor repair before greeting the person who lived beneath it. He stood in the ditch and looked at the roof. "Bad," he said. He came closer, set the ladder against the porch, then lifted one boot and pressed the first board before trusting it. "You paying?" Didn't he ask if you could? Asked if you were. That was the arrangement. For 11 days, weather permitting, Vernon came after breakfast and left before the road froze at dusk. Hannah learned his teaching style by the first hour. He did not praise, he did not explain twice unless the danger deserved it. He pointed with 2 fingers, corrected with short sentences, and expected her to watch the work before attempting it. Hannah looked down. She pulled it. She drove the next one. She pulled that too. By the 3rd day, her shoulders burned from carrying shingles up the ladder, and her palms had opened under the borrowed gloves where the seams rubbed. Vernon showed her how to sister the weakened rafter from inside before they trusted weight above. They cut a salvaged 2x6 to length with a handsaw Abel lent from the store, lifted it alongside the old rafter, and fastened it with staggered screws, not nails, because the old wood would split if bullied. Vernon made her pre-drill every hole. "Old wood remembers insult," he said. That was almost a speech for him. Outside they stripped the failed tin first, working from the ladder and then from roof brackets made out of scrap lumber. Snow slid off in wet sheets and struck the ground with heavy sighs. Beneath the tin, cedar shakes crumbled in Hannah's hands. Some had gone punky enough to push a thumb through. The decking below was not gone everywhere, but it had softened near the chimney, and one board had to be cut out entirely. Vernon taught her the chalk line on the 5th day. "Snap once," he said. "Believe it." The blue line appeared across the felt, clean and delicate as a horizon. He showed her the 3-stroke nail: set, drive, finish. Not 5 nervous taps. Not one brutal hit that split the shingle. 3 strokes, each with a reason. He made her practice on scrap until the nail heads lay flat, neither proud nor buried. "Roof sheds water," he said. Not pride. Hannah did not answer. She was holding a shingle in place with 2 cold fingers and trying not to drop the nails clenched in her teeth. The work changed the building by inches, first the rotten boards gone, then the sister rafter fixed, then felt rolled and nailed with cap nails Vernon found in a coffee can at his house, then starter course. then rows of mismatched shingles, grey, brown, weathered green, a patchwork nobody would call handsome from the road, but every course straight enough to turn rain. Around the chimney, Vernon made her stop and watch flashing. "Water thinks," he said. He bent the step, flashing with pliers, working each piece into the joint where roof met brick. They could not rebuild the chimney yet, but they could keep water from pouring beside it. He sealed nothing verkepi to hat foolish thick tar where metal should do the work. Roof cement was for edges and emergencies, he said, not for hiding laziness. On December muy bone, just after noon, Hannah drove the last ridge nail under Vernon's eye. "Fine," he said. It was the highest praise he offered. They climbed down slowly. Hannah's legs trembled when her boots touched ground. From the ditch, the repaired section looked plain, uneven in colour, and beautiful only to a person who knew where water had once entered and now would not. Vernon accepted one apple, took 3 bites, and handed the core to the ditch for birds. "Chimney next," he said. "No," he said, looking up at the cracked crown. "You don tea." January turned the building into a lesson in stone. The roof held through Christmas rain and New Year snow, but the chimney began shedding itself in small red crumbs that appeared each morning on the rear slope and along the stovepipe thimble. Spalling bricks split at the faces where water had entered, frozen, widened, and thawed across more winters than Hannah had lived. Mortar powdered under her finger. The chimney crown had cracked deeply enough that light showed through one seam when she stood behind the building at sunset. She did not use the stove except in brief, careful burns, and even then she watched smoke more than flame. Abel came out on January Sow with a canvas bag of masonry tools and no announcement. He stood in the snow behind the post office. One cloudy eye narrowed against the light, and examined the chimney for a long while. He allowed himself one dry breath that might have been amusement. Both. He gave her the list in pencil. Hydraulic lime, fire clay, sharp sand, replacement brick, salvaged if possible, chimney cap, wire brush, tuck pointer, joint raker, bucket not used for food, gloves if she wanted to keep skin. He recommended a mortar mix for the upper stack, 1 part natural hydraulic lime, 1 part fire clay near the flue, and 3 parts sharp sand, adjusted only enough for workability. For places away from heat he allowed lime and sand alone, but the firebox area and flue joints deserved respect. "Portland cement is too hard for that old brick," he said. "It will win, and winning will break the thing it is supposed to hold." Hannah wrote that down. The salvaged bricks came from the Granger Barnes fallen summer kitchen vey. Kepite had permission from the elderly man who had watched her from the mailbox in November. His name was Mr. Bender, though the sorting shelf had listed Bender long before Hannah knew his face. He told her to take only what had already fallen and to watch for nails. His dog, the horse one, followed Hannah around the ruin and inspected each brick as if hired by the council. For 3 weeks, the chimney governed her days. The temperatures stayed mostly in the 20s, sometimes rising to 32 in the afternoon and falling hard after sunset. Mortar did not like such weather. Abel warned her, Vernon warned her, the manual warned her in a paragraph underlined by some previous owner. She warmed the mixing water indoors beside the stove, kept the sand covered, worked only during the best hours, and wrapped fresh joints in burlap at mortf night beneath a tarp tied to walnut limbs and porch posts. Her hands went numb every 15 minutes. At first she ignored it, then she learned that ignored fingers became clumsy fingers, and clumsy fingers dropped bricks, misjudged joints, tore skin, so she made herself stop. Every quarter hour she climbed down or stepped back, tucked her bare hands under her arms or near the coffee can of warm water, and waited until pain returned. Pain meant blood had remembered the route. The old mortar came out with a joint raker, slow and gritty. She cleaned Earzahat joint to sound material, brushed dust away, misted the brick lightly, and packed new mortar deep rather than smearing the face. Abel showed her how to hold the hawk and tuck pointer, how to press rather than decorate, how to strike the joint once it had firmed enough to take shape without pulling. "No frosting cakes," he said. The top 12 courses came down carefully, brick by brick, each one numbered in chalk where it might be reused. The worst bricks went into a discard pile by the burdock. The sound ones were cleaned with the wire brush until their edges showed. Replacement bricks differed in shade, but Abel said the chimney had earned honest patches. Inside, Hannah cleaned the flue again after each day's work because bits of mortar and brick fell no matter how careful she was. She kept the medal and letter wrapped and away from dust. The sealed mail sacks remained in the safe, protected, and each night she locked the cedar disc, not because she feared the dead, but because work sites made accidents. By late January, the rebuilt stack rose above the roofline in square, steady courses. The crown was sloped properly now, not flat to collect water. Abel fitted a simple cap and screen, warning her that no cap excused neglect. Vernon came by once, stood in the road, looked up, and said, "Straighter." Hannah took that home like a ribbon. The test fire happened on January High Machine. She waited for a still afternoon, cold but not bitter, with the sky clear and the wind moving lightly from the northwest. Abel stood outside where he could see the chimney. Hannah knelt by the stove with dry kindling, newspaper, and 3 split pieces of oak Mr. Bender had left near the porch without a note. She lit the paper. The flame took. Smoke lifted. The stovepipe warmed with its familiar ticking. For 1 second, then 10, then a full minute. No smoke entered the room. Hannah added the oak. The fire deepened from bright yellow to a steadier orange, and heat began moving outward through iron. Abel opened the rear door and leaned in. "Clean," he said. Hannah stepped outside. Smoke rose from the new cap in a narrow blue-grey column, then turned and thinned into the winter air. It did not seep from brick. It did not drift under the eaves. It went where it had been asked to go. She stood in the snow and watched until the column disappeared against the sky. The floors began showing themselves after the chimney warmed the rooms long enough to dry the boards. What had looked merely dirty in November Nove kept revealed grain beneath grime. White pine, wide plank, some boards nearly 14 inches across, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails that had darkened into small square shadows. Near the front left window, water damage had stained several planks, but not all the way through. Behind the counter, where feet had stood for decades sorting letters, the pine had worn into a shallow trough as smooth as handled soap. Hannah decided not to replace what could be saved. Abel rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, then reduced it to $10 when she raised one eyebrow and said nothing. The machine came in a red plastic case with extra sanding discs and a cord patched twice with electrical tape. Abel made her repeat the safety instructions back to him before he let her carry it out. She began with the front room after removing every loose object she could carry. The postal scale, the broken chair, the canvas sacks, the forms, the old notices, the tools, the ledger, the blue box, the medal, the letter, all were wrapped or stacked in the back room under a sheet. The service counter remained too large and too fixed to move, so she worked around it on hands and knees with a sanding block where the machine could not reach. First pass, Tammy gripped. The sander roared in the narrow room, a rude modern sound that seemed at first to insult the silence. Dust rose despite the bag. It settled in her hair, on her eyelashes, along the counter, in the lines of her neck. The top layer came away slowly, dirt, grey varnish, old wax, water-stain anonymous years. Beneath it, the pine appeared pale and startled. She worked in strips with the grain, never staying too long in one place. The damaged boards near the window required caution. She did not try to erase every mark. A floor scrubbed of history would have been another kind of lie. Second pass, Chamhaimi grit. The room softened under her hands. Splinters disappeared. The worn trough behind the counter became visible as a gentle hollow rather than damage. Nail heads emerged, rose-shaped and irregular, each one set by a person who had not imagined a hungry young woman would be sanding around them more than a century later. When a nail sat proud, she stopped and set it carefully with a punch Abel had loaned, tapping until metal went below wood. Third pass, Heichemheimi grit. This was not necessary everywhere. Vernon said, when he stopped by and found her covered in dust like a miller. He said it as if softness were suspicious. "Mort want to feel the boards with bare feet someday," Hannah said. He considered that. The finishing took longer than sanding. Abel recommended tung oil cut for the first coat so it would penetrate, then linseed oil in thin coats where the pine seemed thirsty. Hannah tested in a corner behind the counter. The wood darkened at once, not brown exactly, but honey deepening toward amber. After the second coat, red undertones appeared near the knots. After the third, with 48 hours of cure between coats and every window cracked when weather allowed, the boards had gone from dark honey to something close to mahogany in the oldest, hardest used places. The floor did not shine. It glowed low. The work smelled of oil, pine, dust, and winter air. For nearly 2 weeks, she moved through the rooms in socks, stepping only where coats had dried, shifting boxes, keeping the stove modest, waiting through cure times because impatience would print itself in tacky footprints. Waiting had become part of the repair, as real as nails. Then came the bad morning. It was January balmy mot. No storm, no emergency. The roof held, the chimney drew, the floors were nearly finished, and sunlight lay across the front room in a clean band. Hannah woke and could not rise. Not from illness. Not exactly. Her body simply refused the agreement. Her hands throbbed. One shoulder burned from sanding. The skin across her knuckles had split again. The thought of lifting the brush, wiping oil, carrying water, or even writing the next list in the notebook made the air around her feel too thin. She sat up behind the counter, put on her boots, and went outside without breakfast. Past the walnut tree, past the creek bend, beyond a marshy low place where cattails rattled in the wind, a great blue heron stood in water thinly skinned with ice. It was motionless at first, grey-blue body folded into itself, long legs black against the shallows. Hannah sat on a fallen log and watched. For an hour, nothing happened. Then the heron moved its head. That was all. A slight turn, a calculation, a patience older than carpentry, older than mail, older than grief written into letters. The bird lifted one foot and set it down with such care that the water barely accepted the change. Hannah stayed there until the cold entered her coat. She did no work that day. She did not punish herself for it. In the evening, she warmed oatmeal on the stove, read 2 paragraphs of Clara Mayer's letter, and slept before the moon rose. The next morning, the brush waited where she had left it, neither offended nor hurried. By February, the windows could no longer be called a temporary problem. There were 8 in all if she counted the small rear pantry window and the attic gable. 3 had no glass. 4 were cracked. 1, in the east wall behind the sorting case, still held its original wavy pane, marked in the corner with faint hand lettering from a glassworks no longer operating. Abel guessed late 19th century. Vernon said maybe Mort Tam Tam Tam, maybe later. Hannah misheard him the first time and wrote Mort Bay Tam Tam in the notebook, then stared at the impossible date until Vernon saw it and snored. Building S old, he said. Not powdered wig old. She crossed out the 7 and wrote an 8 carefully, then left the correction visible. The original pane would not be replaced. The others could be saved or patched. Abel found salvaged glass from storm windows in his storage shed and sold it by the piece for less than he should have. He also gave her a half can of DAP 33 glazing putty with a skin formed over the top, saying good putty looked ruined before it was worked back to life. The glazing points came from her first purchase. The putty knife cost another $1 on credit. Sash cord 1/4-inch cotton came from a spool Abel kept behind the counter because old houses still came in asking for old solutions. Hannah began with the front right window because it faced the road and because every passerby saw the crack before seeing anything she had mended. She removed the sash by cutting paint lines with the utility knife and easing the stops free without splitting them. The sash weights thudded inside their pockets when the rotten cord finally gave. She labelled each hat piece in pencil. Left stop, right stop, top rail, bottom rail. She took out the broken glass wearing Abel-S gloves, which were too large but better than bare skin, and laid the shards in a box marked dangerous because she believed future care began with present label. Old putty came away in stubborn strips. Some had hardened like stone. Some remained gummy beneath the surface. She worked slowly so the muntins would not break. The wood underneath was dry but sound. She brushed it clean, warmed the new putty in her hands, rolled it into a thin rope and bedded the salvaged pane against it. Glazing points went in with the edge of the putty knife, 2 per side, pressed just enough to hold without cracking glass. The final bevel took practice. Dat Bummy Bar did not forgive a nervous wrist. The line had to be angled cleanly from glass to wood so water would shed. Too much putty looked heavy. Too little exposed the seam. Abel showed her once on a scrap sash behind the store, drawing the knife in one deliberate motion. "Do not pet it," he said. "Lay it down and leave it." Back at the post office, Hannah ruined the first line, scraped it out, and tried again. The second was passable. The third almost pleased her. By the fourth window, her hand understood more than her head did. The sash cords were stranger. Inside each weight pocket hung an iron counterweight, cold, dusty, shaped like an elongated pear. The new 1/4-inch cotton cord had to pass over the pulley down to the weight and be tied with a figure-8 knot large enough not to slip but neat enough not to jam in the channel. Hannah practiced the knot on her own wrist until she could make it without looking. The first time she reassembled a sash and lifted it, the window rose and she laughed under her breath. Not loudly, just enough to fog the glass. Window by window, the building's face changed. Plastic came down, cardboard was removed, light entered the Kepitet edges again, not milky and warped, but clear enough to show dust, grain and breath. The rooms grew colder at first while she worked, then warmer once the sashes seated properly and the putty sealed the draft. She left the original east pane untouched, except to clean it with vinegar and newspaper, revealing bubbles and waves in the glass that bent the world beyond it into something almost remembered. The last window was the small rear one above the work table. It had been cracked in a crescent near the lower corner, and Hannah had saved it for last because the sash was stuck hardest. She worked at it on a February afternoon, while thaw dripped from the eaves and the creak sounded louder than it had in weeks. Her hands moved through the sequence without panic now. Score paint, ease stop, free sash, remove points, lift glass, clean rabbit, bed pane, set points, bevel putty, thread cord, tie figure-8, test weight, replace stop. As she pressed the final putty line smooth, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It was close enough that she could see its black cap, white cheek, and tiny feet gripping the bark. The bird tilted its head toward the glass, then toward Hannah, bright-eyed and without concern for deeds. Debt? Sealed letters? Roofing nails? Or the burden of inheritance? Hannah held still. The chickadee tapped once at the branch, shook loose a bead of thaw water, and flew. Hannah set the putty knife down. Through the repaired window the walnut tree stood clear, the horseshoe hit on the far side, the creek beyond it moving under February light. The room behind her smelled of linseed oil, ash, glass dust and lime. The floor held, the chimney drew, the roof shed water. The windows opened and closed by their own old weights. For the first time, the post office did not feel like a condemned structure she was preventing from dying. It felt like a building remembering how to keep weather outside. The plaster began failing after the room became warm enough to reveal what cold had been concealing. For months the walls had looked merely stained and tired, their cracks hidden by dust, their soft places stiffened by freezing air. But once the chimney drew clean and the windows held, warmth entered the old rooms and asked the plaster what it still believed about itself. 3 patches near the chimney answered honestly. One bulged in a shallow oval above the stovepipe. One had opened along a diagonal crack where the old lath had shifted. The third, just below the ceiling, sounded hollow when Hannah tapped it with 2 knuckles. She did not want another trade to learn. She stood beneath the largest bulge with Abel's manual open in one hand and Clara May's letter folded into her coat pocket, and for one plain minute she hated the patience required of ruined things. A roof was one thing. A chimney could be understood as stone stacked against weather. Floors at least had grain, windows had weight and rope and glass, but plaster seemed more like skin, too easy to wound, too easy to make worse. Abel came to look on February Jaime Mott and pressed the wall with his thumb. "Horsehair," he said. A piece had fallen near the baseboard, revealing pale plaster threaded with dark fibres and hand-split oak lath beneath it. The lath strips were uneven. Each one nailed Vecchepite hat small cut nails and spaced by a builder's eye rather than a factory measure. Behind them waited the wall cavity, cold and dry. "Original?" Hannah asked. He went back to his truck and returned with a paper sack folded over twice and tied with twine. The printing had faded, but she could still read part of it. "Myson's hair, clean muchi numisau." Abel held it as if it were flour from a country that no longer existed. "Found it in my father's loft," he said. "Do not sneeze in it." The repair took 3 coats and more humility than strength. First she cut back the failed plaster to sound edges, scoring with the utility knife, then tapping lightly until loose material gave way. She did not chase every crack. Abel warned her that some cracks had finished moving long ago and needed filling, not punishment. She brushed the exposed lath clean, misted it lightly, and mixed the scratch coat in a bucket that would never again touch food. Lime. Sand. A small measure of old horsehair teased apart by hand so it would not clump. Water added slowly. The mixture had to cling without slumping. Too wet and it fell. Too dry and it refused the lath. The first handful felt impossible. She pressed it through the gaps so it mushroomed behind the lath and formed keys. Abel called those keys the part you could not see and therefore the part most likely to be neglected. When the patch had filled, she scored the surface with the edge of a broken comb in crossing lines so the next coat would have something to scratch coat. Wait. The brown coat came after the first had stiffened and cured enough not to tear away. It went on thicker, about 3/8 of an inch, built out to nearly match the old wall but left shy of the final surface. Hannah used a straight board to check the plane, scraping high places, filling low ones, learning that a wall could be honest without being flat in a modern way. Then 72 hours of waiting, not because she wanted to wait, but because lime kept working after hands were done. During those 3 days she did smaller things. She cleaned the brass post office boxes with paste wax and a rag. She copied names from the ledger into a second notebook so the original could remain safe. She walked to town and back for flour, salt, and another box of matches. She stood by the walnut tree each morning, not praying, not asking, only checking whether the horseshoe still held its visible arc in the bar. The finished coat was thin, no more than 1/8 inch. Lime putty and fine sand worked smooth with a steel trowel Abel had sharpened along one edge. It required a lighter hand than Hannah possessed at first. Her first pass left ridges, her second dragged. On the third she learned to let the trowel float. When the last patch had set enough to hold its shape, she stepped back. The repairs did not disappear, they were not meant to. Under afternoon light, a careful eye could see the difference between old plaster and new, between a century of smoke-washed surface and the pale, fresh skin of repair. But the wall was closed, the lath was protected. The chimney corner no longer shed dust when the stove warmed. Hannah touched the largest patch with the backs of her fingers. She said it softly, not as a claim the world had to honour, but as an instruction to her own hands. Do work as if it might be asked to last longer than fear. Doris came first in paper bag. The Sugar Bowl Cafe stood on the square with its windows steamed each morning, and its chalkboard always lettered in a hand too elegant for meatloaf specials. Hannah had avoided it for weeks because warm restaurants made hunger visible, but after the roof work, Vernon took her there without asking. He ordered coffee, toast, and 2 eggs for himself, then pointed at the chair across from him until Hannah sat down. Doris Bell owned the place, cooked half the food, served the other half, and carried herself with the brisk mercy of a woman who had spent 30 years watching people pretend not to need what they needed. Her hair was white, cut short, and held back with 2 black pins. She wore white tennis shoes, a flour-dusted apron and a pencil tucked into the knot of its strings. Her forearms were strong from lifting stockpiles. "You the post office girl," she said, setting coffee in front of Vernon. Hannah looked at the table. "Yes." "Ma'am." Doris wrote nothing down. "That is not an answer that helps a kitchen." "She eats eggs," Vernon said. Doris brought 2 plates. Hannah ate slowly at first, then with a concentration she could not disguise. Doris did not watch, that was part of the kindness. She wiped the counter, corrected the radio volume, scolded a man in a seed cap for leaving mud near the door, and let Hannah finish without requiring performance. The paper bags began the next week. They appeared on the post office porch before dawn, folded twice at the top and weighted with a stone. Inside might be day-old rolls, soup in a jar, heel ends of bread, a half-dozen eggs wrapped in newspaper, or once, in a small tin, chicken and noodles thick enough to stand a spoon in. Hannah walked to town with the jars and tins washed clean and tried to pay. Doris slid them back across the counter. Doris turned away before Hannah could answer, and the matter was closed by the authority of a woman holding a coffee pot. Caleb arrived with a Schwinn bike and a splitting maul. He was 16, narrow-shouldered, all wrists and elbows, with hair that fell into his eyes and boots too large for him in a way that suggested borrowed older brother history. The bicycle was red once, though rust had freckled the handlebars and one pedal clicked every rotation. He leaned it against the walnut tree on a Saturday morning in late February and stood near the porch with the maul over one shoulder. "You need wood split," he said. Hannah looked past him toward the road, expecting a parent. "Mrs. Bender." That explained the dog, the barn, the careful permission to take bricks, and perhaps the bundles of oak that had appeared near the porch without a note. Caleb glanced at the building, then at his boots. "She said about your grandfather." He nodded once, relieved by a correction that did not send him away. The woodpile behind the post office was not much of a pile yet. Mr. Bender had allowed her to collect deadfall along the fence, and Vernon had shown her which pieces were too rotten to bother with. Caleb set a round upright, lifted the maul and split it cleanly. The crack rang across the yard. He worked without talking, except when Hannah dragged the split pieces into a stack beneath the overhang. "What can pay a little?" she said after an hour. My mother said, "About your grandfather." This time he looked up when he said it, and Hannah understood that the sentence was carrying more than one errand. Amos had delivered something once, or repaired something, or stood in some lane with some paper that mattered. The details had thinned, but the obligation had not. Caleb came most Saturdays through March. He split wood, carried salvage, and once climbed the porch roof to retrieve a shingle wrapper caught in the gutter, because he was young enough to move without hearing every possible consequence. Hannah fed him rolls from Doris S. bags and taught him how to set a glazing point after he asked what the strange little triangles were for. He pretended indifference, then stayed until dark finishing the sash. Reverend Boyd did not bring food or tools. He brought a route. Every morning at 7 he walked Hawley Bend Road in a black coat, black hat and boots polished beyond reason for a gravel lane. He was pastor of a church outside Dicker, though he lived with his widowed sister past the second bridge and made the walk for his heart his doctor, and he admitted once his temper. He had a long face, brown hands, and a voice so low it seemed to come up from floorboards rather than throat. The first week, he tipped his hat and continued. The second, he paused at the ditch. "You settling?" He never asked to come in. He never asked what she had found, though the town had by then grown its own small weather of talk around the old post office. He stood in the road each morning, tipped his hat, and said 4 words before walking on. That was all. Not keep her safe, which no honest person could guarantee. Not bless this enterprise, which would have sounded too grand for cracked plaster and unpaid accounts. Keep her in mercy. The phrase moved down the road with him after he passed, leaving the air steadier, One morning in March, Hannah saw him stop beneath the walnut tree and look up at the horseshoe half swallowed in bark. He did not touch it. He only removed his hat for a moment, then put it back on and continued toward town. The seller waited until February muy mort because Hannah had learned the difference between delay and avoidance only after writing both words in the notebook. She had postponed it for weather, for roof work, for chimney safety, for windows, for plaster, for lack of light, for lack of a proper lantern, for damp, for caution. All had been reasonable. Reasonable excuses were still excuses once their usefulness had expired. The cellar hatch lay beneath the hooked rug in the back room, its iron ring dark with rust, and its outline nearly hidden by floor dust. She cleared the room first, tools away, candle away, letter wrapped, ledger on the counter, the safe locked. Coffee can filled with water, matches in pocket, Abel S. borrowed lantern set on the floor. She tied one end of a rope to the stove leg and the other around her waist, then untied it after realizing if the stove shifted she would create a second emergency. She tied it instead around the base of the service counter. The hatch lifted with a groan. Cold air rose from below, damp and mineral, smelling of stone, earth, and shut-in years. The lantern light fell across 7 granite steps descending into darkness. Mrs. Kozlowski had been right, wet, uneven. Each step had been worn in the centre by older feet, and the edges shone faintly where moisture gathered. Hannah waited until her eyes adjusted. Then she went down one step at a time. The cellar measured roughly 12 by 15 feet, with a fieldstone floor laid more carefully than she expected. The walls were limestone and earth, patched in places verkeptehat old brick. Wooden shelves ran along the north side, most empty, some holding glass jars clouded beyond identification. A rusted coal scuttle sat near the west wall. Roots had entered through one corner in fine pale threads, feeling their way through mortar. At the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not belong to the rest of the fieldstone. The slab was rectangular, smooth across the top, and set flush with the surrounding stones. On its face, carved shallow but clear, was a mark, a bookbinding press screw crossed with a sheaf of wheat encircled by a narrow border. The symbol matched the bow of an old brass finishing tool Hannah had found in the oilcloth bundle, though she had not understood it then as a family mark. She crouched near it, lantern held low. The slab had iron lifting rings set flat into 2 recesses, both black with age. She did not touch them. The cellar was not ready, and neither was she. The granite had weight in more than one sense. Whatever lay beneath, if anything lay beneath, could wait for a season when her hands were less occupied with survival. "Not today," she said. Her voice sounded wrong underground. She examined the shelves instead. The coal bin, the root threads, the corners where water might enter during spring melt. She made notes. Lime wash needed. Shelf repair possible. Do not store paper down here. Watch east wall after rain. On the stairs going up, her boot struck something that did not sound like stone. The third step from the top had a looseness near the right side. Hannah set the lantern on the step above and felt beneath the overhang. Her fingers touched wood, not the step itself, a small object wedged into a gap where granite met foundation. She worked it loose slowly, scraping her knuckles until it came free in a fall of grit. An oak box. It was no longer than her hand, dark with age, bound by a tiny brass class green at the edges. The lid stuck, then opened with a sigh of dry wood. Inside lay a brass key and a photograph. The key was unlike the post office keys. Older, heavier, its bow shaped like the same craft symbol carved into the granite slab, press screw and wheat. Its shaft was short, its bit complicated. Hannah turned it in the lantern light, watching brass catch and release the flame. The photograph was a tintype held in a paper sleeve. A young woman stood in front of the post office cottage, or what must have been the cottage before the office swallowed its rooms into later use. She wore a dark dress, sleeves fitted at the wrist, hair parted at the centre and pinned low. In one hand she held a finishing tool. Her face stopped Hannah's breath. Not because it was identical, because it carried the family plainly enough to make denial foolish. The same long line from cheek to chin, the same set of the mouth when unsmiling, the same brow Hannah had seen in mirrors above gas station sinks and library bathrooms during weeks when she barely recognized herself. This young woman from Motnin-Chimbar looked out of the type, as if interrupted at work and willing to wait for the viewer to become worthy of the interruption. Hannah turned it over. In brown ink, faded but legible, someone had written Miriam Whittaker, daughter of Thomas, age Jaime Lam, summer of Motnin-Chimbar. She sat on the cellar step until the cold stone entered through her jeans. Miriam, daughter of the founder S-Line, not Clara, not Amos. Earlier, a woman holding the tool of the trade in front of this place when the walnut tree must have been younger and the road rougher and the world still finding ways to make women-s work disappear into men-s records. The brass key lay in Hannah's palm. She did not know what it opened. She searched the cellar door, the safe, the lower cabinet, the blue box, the tool chest, and the 3 remaining locks she Canoeve kept about in the building. Nothing. The key entered none of them. Its bit was too elaborate. Its purpose elsewhere. By evening, she placed it on the mantel beside the beeswax candle stub and the military medal. The tintype she wrapped in clean paper and tucked with Clara Mayer's letter. The key remained visible because mysteries hidden too well began to resemble fear. Each morning after that, the key caught a little light from the east window. It waited without explaining itself. Snow retreated badly, without grace, leaving grey piles along the ditch and mud deep enough to take a boot if Hannah stepped carelessly. By March the creek had grown loud with snowmelt. It ran brown and muscled beneath the willows, carrying sticks, foam, old leaves, and once a child red ball that must have come from some farmyard upstream. The walnut trees changed more slowly. First the buds tightened, then loosened. Catkins appeared like green-brown tassels, modest and strange, trembling in wind that no longer cut the skin. The road softened. Trucks left ruts. Birds returned by voice before body. Hidden in brush, stitching the mornings with calls Hannah could not yet name. Inside, the post office smelled different. Less of mouse and damp, more of wood smoke, oil, lime and clean paper. The plaster patches cured pale and firm. The floor no longer raised dust veil kept ite hut every step. The windows admitted light in separate squares, each one showing a slightly different version of spring. Doris' jars lined one shelf, washed and waiting to be returned. Caleb's split wood leaned under cover. Vernant's hatchet hung on a nail near the back door until Abel asked for it, then did not come to collect it. The sealed mail sacks remained unopened until Hannah could make a proper plan. That sentence appeared in the notebook 3 times, each underlined with increasing force. She had begun by copying names from the ledger. She would need public records, obituaries, county archives, perhaps state databases at the library, perhaps letters of her own. She would need to know what could legally be returned, what belonged to descendants, what belonged to history, what belonged to the federal service that had forgotten the building but might not have forgotten the law. The work was larger than hunger, and for once hunger could not be allowed to set the pace. The craft waited too. That surprised her more. She had thought, after reading Clara May's letter, that fold blank sections, cook paste, wax thread, practice stitching, touch the tools and feel some door open because inheritance, in stories, often announced itself with music. But March did not give her music. It gave her mud, thaw, taxes, a roofline to check after each rain and the honest fatigue of a body still catching up with winter. So she made a decision. She would not begin the trade that spring. She would order small materials with 1 coin from the cash box, not from the sealed sacks, 1 worn silver dime, recorded in the notebook, exchanged through Abel's cousin who knew a collector and returned more than face value. With that money she would buy practice paper, linen thread and a little wheat starch. Not calfskin, not gold, not yet. She would begin on scraps, on blank sections, on errors that harmed no beloved book. She would learn the way Clara May had instructed. Severe enough to spare waste, patient enough to let skill arrive without being dragged. On the first warm day in April, Hannah opened Beotehat front windows and the rear door. Air moved through the building from road to creek. It lifted the corner of a receipt from Moninchin Tamisao and stirred the edge of the county deed on the counter. Outside, the chickadee returned to the walnut branch, or another chickadee did, indistinguishable to a human but entirely itself. Reverend Boyd passed at 7 and tipped his hat. Caleb's bicycle clicked by at noon. Doris sent a bag containing 2 rolls, 3 eggs, and a note that said only, "Soon." Hannah set the note beside the key. She swept the front room, wiped the service counter, and stood for a while beneath the faded post office sign. No customers came. No mail arrived. No sudden answer presented itself. That was all right. The house had been waiting, and so had she. 2 winters later, in December Haikomhaimi 2, the first finished book lay beneath weight on the old work table while snow gathered again on the walnut limbs outside. It was not large, 5 by 7 inches, blank inside, sewn on linen tapes with boards cut from salvage stock covered in plain brown leather. No gold, no ornament except a single blind tooled line around the cover, made with Clara May's brass tool heated too cautiously at first, then correctly after Hannah tested the mark on 6 scraps and ruined 4. The leather turn-ins were not perfect. One corner was thicker than the other 3. The paste-down held a small wrinkle near the hinge, visible only when opened under angled light, but visible all the same. Hannah loved it because it told the truth. She had made 23 practice structures before that one, folded sections until her fingertips, caneur eve kept paper grain, pierced stations by measure, not guess, cooked wheat paste to a patient gloss and threw out 2 batches that went lumpy because she had rushed the stirring. Learned that hide glue did indeed betray bad temperature by smell, learned to change blotters after the first hour even when the book seemed dry enough, learned that thread tension could make a spine either living or strangle. When the little book came out from under weight on December mere time, she carried it to the east window and opened it carefully. The pages lay flat. Not perfectly, but honestly. The restored interior around her had become neither museum nor fantasy. It was still modest. The front room held the service counter, cleaned but not stripped of its worn places. 3 brass post office boxes remained in the wall, polished enough to catch light but not enough to erase age. The bulletin board still held 1 zip code poster and a new index card pinned beside it. The floor had darkened under 2 winters of oil boots and swept ash. Shelves behind the counter now held paper wrapped in cloth, linen thread in jars, finishing tools in a shallow drawer, and the ledger copied into clean binders. The back room had become the workshop Clara May had prepared for without living to see. A sewing frame built from plans Abel found in an old trade book sat near the window. A nipping press, bought second-hand from a college library sale in La Crosse, occupied the corner where the broken chair had once stood. The pot-bellied stove burned clean in cold months, its pipe black and true. The plaster patches had cured to a soft lime colour. On the mantel stood the beeswax candle stub, the bronze medal, the tint type of Miriam Whittaker, and the brass key with its press screw bow. For nearly 2 years, the key had opened nothing. Then, in the autumn of Haikomhaimi 2, during a windstorm that stripped half the walnut leaves in one night, a dead limb cracked from the old tree behind the post office and fell near the wash line. Hannah went out at dawn with a saw and found that the break had exposed a hollow seam high on the trunk's south side, not where the horseshoe showed, but below it, hidden by bark folds and shadow. At first she thought rot had opened the tree. Then she saw a rectangle. Not natural. A brass plate, dark green with weather, set into the trunk where the tree had grown around it. She did not touch it that morning. Rain was still falling, and wet bark could deceive the eye. She waited until the following day, then carried out the ladder Vernon had helped repair, set it carefully between roots, and climbed until the plate sat level with her chest. Lichen covered its lower edge, bark pressed around it like a sealed wound. At the centre was a keyhole. Her hand knew before her mind agreed. The brass key from the cellar slid in halfway, stopped, then entered fully when she lifted slightly and turned. The mechanism resisted, not from wrongness, but from long waiting. Hannah worked it gently, backing off, trying again, feeling for the old tumblers through her fingertips. At last it turned. A narrow door, no wider than a book cover, opened inward into the hollow of the walnut. Inside was a tin cylinder wrapped in oilcloth. She carried it down before opening it because some discoveries deserved ground beneath both feet. At the work table, she unwrapped the oilcloth and removed the cylinder S-lid. Within lay a folded Bomitam Star American flag, small but carefully made, its fabric dry because the tin had held. Beneath it was a note on heavy paper. The handwriting was not Clara May-S. Older, more slanted. The ink had browned but remained legible. Motam Annabel Whittaker, wife of Elias Thomas and mother to Samuel Reed. This flag was given to me in marching time by the Ladies' Auxiliary after my brother Joseph Bell died at Camp Dodge during the influenza. He had trained for war and was taken by breath before he crossed the sea. Mort folded it away because public grief is often easier for towns than private grief is for kitchens. If the walnut has kept this safe, then the house still has watchers. Do not mistake a nation's cloth for a nation's smoke. They are not always the same. But remember the young who left, the young who could not leave, the mothers who ironed shirts for both, and the hands that kept record when names began to vanish. Keep the flag dry. Keep the tools sharp. Keep the door open to the one who arrives honest. November Miamot. Mortneen Cheen Miatam. Hannah read the date twice. November Miamot. Motneen Chin Tam. Armistice Day. The day the First World War ended, and the day so many houses were still sick with influenza, mourning in a silence that victory parades could not reach. She refolded the flag along its old creases and placed it in a new archival box ordered through the library, paid for by 3 restored ledgers she had repaired for the County Historical Society. The note went beside Clara May's letter, Miriam's tintype and Amos S. photograph, which Hannah had finally unfolded and framed in simple oak. The bronze medal for Elias Samuel Whittaker did not remain on the mantel forever. On June Sow, Haicum Haimitu, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, Hannah took it to the cemetery outside Decorah where the Whittaker family stone stood beneath bur oaks. Elias was buried in France according to records she had found with help from Mrs. Koslowski and a librarian who knew military archives, but his name had been carved on the family marker below the words "Lost in Service, Morchin Bon Tu." Hannah stood there in early morning with dew soaking the hems of her jeans and laid the medal in a small cedar box at the base of the stone for the length of 1 hour. She did not leave it there to be stolen by weather or anyone as good intentions. Honour did not require negligence. After the hour, she wrapped it again and brought it home. The money in the safe lasted because she treated it as Clara May had instructed. 3 coins were spent at first, then 2 more over the following year, 1 silver dime for practice materials, 2 wheat pennies framed into the first shop sign as a private mark, 1 buffalo nickel traded toward a better all after the old handle split. The Mortneen Chin Saumi 2 Kennedy $50 remained in its birthday envelope, because Eddie, whoever he had once been loved by someone who meant him to have it. The cash helped with winter only when there was no honest alternative. $50 for chimney material after the first estimate proved too hopeful. $23 for medicine when Hannah caught bronchitis in the second march, and Doris threatened to fetch the doctor herself. $12.80 to file copies of notices related to the mail sacks, because returning old obligations sometimes required modern fees. Every withdrawal was written in the ledger. Most of the money remained sealed in a new archival envelope inside the registered safe with a note in Hannah's hand. For the next one, if hungry, cold, or roof open. The sealed mail sacks were not all resolved quickly. Nothing about the past moved quickly once the living tried to honour it. Hannah opened them only after speaking with the county attorney. A retired postal inspector reached through 3 phone calls, and Mrs. Koslowski, who knew which records could be searched without charging a person into surrender. Some letters went to descendants, Verkepite hat careful explanation. Some money orders had long expired but still carried meaning in the names. One birthday envelope found its way to a woman in Minnesota who cried on the phone because Eddie had been her father and no one in the family had known why his aunt stopped writing in Morning Chintam Sao. A bundle of letters from a farm wife to a son in the Navy went to a granddaughter in Oregon, who sent back a photograph of herself holding them at a kitchen table. Not every trail ended in a person. Some ended in cemetery records, some in courthouse books, some in returned envelopes Hannah kept in a cabinet labelled attempts made. The work became part of the life of the place, slow, clerical, reverent, exact. The shop reopened without a sign at first. Doris made sure of it. One Tuesday in October, Hannah walked into the Sugar Bowl Cafe and found an index card pinned to the corkboard between a babysitting notice and a flyer for a church rummage sale. The card read, Ledgers, Bibbles, Family Books. Hannah recognized Doris' elegant chalkboard hand. There were already 6 names. By Christmas, there were 42 on the mailing list, though Hannah did not call it a mailing list aloud because the phrase made her feel like a business pretending to be larger than its table. Most jobs were modest. A church hymnal ve kepite hat, a detached cover, a farm ledger from Moninchen Jaime Moore, a recipe book held together by rubber bands, a family Bible too damaged for full restoration but stable enough to be boxed and handled by clean hands. She turned away work she could not yet do that became part of the trust. People did not come because she advertised loudly. They came because Doris told them. Abel vouched for the glue. Mrs. Koslowski said the records were clean. Vernon admitted the roof had not leaked. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat. And Caleb told everyone at school that the post office had tools older than the gymnasium. Caleb returned the following spring ver kepi tihat, a wooden sign wrapped in a moving blanket and tied to the back of his father's pickup. He had grown taller, though not broader, and his hair still fell into his eyes. He carried the sign with both hands, refusing help until one corner nearly clipped the porch post. The wood was walnut from a fallen branch. Planed and oiled, the letters hand-carved and painted black. Hannah stared at the plural. There are no daughters, she said. Caleb shrugged, suddenly busy with a splinter near the edge. Were, he said. He looked embarrassed by the sentence, as if it had arrived in his mouth wearing someone else's coat. The carved letters were not perfect. The ampersand leaned slightly, the lower line crowded near the right edge, but the sign had a steadiness that no ordered placard could have carried. It held Miriam, Clara May, Annabelle, Hannah, and the unknown hands that might one day stand at the table after her. It also corrected something the records had failed to keep. Men-s names had owned the deeds. Women-s hands had kept the work alive. Vernon helped hang it because he did not trust Caleb ladder sense. Abel supplied the bolts. Doris brought coffee in a thermos. Reverend Boyd stood in the road and said, Keep her in mercy, though this time Hannah was not sure whether he meant the woman, the building, or the sign. When the bolts were tightened and the ladder taken down, the walnut letters rested beneath the faded post office sign. Old purpose above, continued purpose below. That evening, after everyone had gone, Hannah lit the stove and sat at the work table with a sheet of good paper. She had been delaying another task. Not out of fear this time. Out of respect. Clara May had written because she understood that a house might outlast the person keeping it. Annabelle had written because grief and memory needed a dry place. Amos had left no letter, but his saw had become one. Hannah did not know who would come next. A niece not yet born. A stranger with $1, a tired woman with wet shoes, a boy who had learned to split wood and set glass, a descendant of someone whose letter had finally arrived. She dipped a pen into ink and began. My dear one, whoever you are. The words looked strange in her hand, then less strange as the ink settled into the page. She did not try to imitate Clara May. That would have been another kind of theft. She wrote in her own script, slower than usual, naming the year, the condition of the roof, the location of the safe, the records of the mail sacks, the caution about the cellar slab that still had not been lifted, the key in the walnut, the flag now boxed, the tools and which ones were original, which ones had been replaced, which ones required oil twice yearly. She wrote that the first finished book had one imperfect corner and should not be thrown away if found. She wrote that hunger justified use of the cash, but not carelessness with the names. She wrote that skill came slower than longing and stayed longer than despair if fed by repetition. At the end, she paused. The stove clicked, wind moved across the porch. Somewhere outside, the creek took meltwater from a field it had never seen and carried it past the post office toward larger rivers. On the mantel, the brass key caught firelight. In the wall, the old boxes waited without mail. Above the door, the new sign held its plural quietly. Hannah bent again and wrote the final lines. If you are here because you were sent away, sit down first. The work can wait 1 more hour. Eat if there is food. Sleep if there is room to sleep. Nothing worth keeping asks you to become less human in order to keep it. Then, when your hands are steady, look around. The house is not empty. She let the ink dry before folding the page. Outside, snow began again, soft against the repaired roof, quiet on the porch boards, patient on the road from town. The walnut tree stood with its horseshoe lifted high in the bark, its secret door closed, its roots deep around stone and memory. The creek kept moving. The sign did not swing because Caleb had bolted it well. The post office waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, in a narrow drawer beneath carbon receipt books and old parcel maps, Mrs. Koslowski still kept the first dollar bill Hannah had paid. She had written the date on a paper sleeve and slid it away without telling anyone. Not as evidence, not as charity. As record. Some arrivals deserve to be kept.